They called my magic worthless. They sent me to die in a ruin. Everything they kept is falling apart.
She had been killing monsters since she was 3. Not the kind with teeth, the kind with roots. A weed that grew between the courtyard stones had been her first, and she had pressed her palm against it and felt something shift inside her chest. A warmth, a click, a door opening that no one had shown her how to find. The weed died. Her magic grew. She moved on to mosquitoes, then beetles, then the mice that got into the pantry no one remembered to stock for her. Each kill was a sliver. Each sliver added up. By the time her father dragged her to the church on the morning of her 7th birthday, Sylvia Hughes had more magic in her than anyone in her family suspected, and none of them had thought to check. The priest placed his hands above her head and spoke the words of identification. The church went quiet. Then he announced it. Her skill was the accumulation of magic through the defeat of monsters. Her attribute was life, not fire, not lightning, not the combat magic the Hughes bloodline was famous for, life. Her father's reaction was immediate. He stood from the pew where he had been sitting with the composed authority of a duke and a legendary knight, and he raged. His voice filled the stone chamber. The priest stepped between them, not to comfort Sylvia, but to prevent something worse. He called her magic worthless. He called it an embarrassment. He did not call her anything at all, because by then he had stopped seeing her as a person who required addressing. Sylvia stood in the colored light and watched him leave. She did not cry. She had stopped expecting things from him around the time her younger brother was born, which was also around the time the servants stopped bringing her meals and the tutors stopped appearing. She had learned to cook for herself, to read alone, to tend to small animals, because they did not require her to have the right kind of magic before they would hold still. She was not devastated. She was recalculating. 4 days later, her mother summoned her. The Duchess delivered the exile in 4 sentences. A fortress in the southwest, abandoned, worthless. Go there, live there, do not come back. The phrasing was administrative. The intent was a death sentence dressed in paperwork. Sylvia listened. Then she did something her mother had not anticipated. She negotiated. She told her mother that if she was going to leave, the fortress would be hers, not managed on behalf of the family, hers, in writing, with a contract, signed and sealed before she walked out the door. Her mother almost laughed, a 7-year-old demanding property law, but Sylvia had already awakened a spell she had not told anyone about, contract. She had discovered it the same way she discovered everything, alone, in secret, by reaching for her magic in the dark and finding that it answered in shapes no one had taught her to expect. The Duchess signed. She assumed the contract was a child's game, unenforceable, a scrap of paper that would outlast the girl by months at best. She was wrong. Sylvia's magic made the transfer permanent, binding, and irrevocable. The fortress now belonged to a 7-year-old who had no intention of dying in it. Sylvia packed a wagon. She selected livestock from the estate, a horse, a cow, a pig, a goat, chickens, sheep, with the focused attention of someone building an inventory, not fleeing a home. She pressed her palm to each animal and whispered a word that was not quite a word, and each one fell into step behind her. Domination. Her magic recognized those she claimed. The animals recognized her as their leader. She walked out of the Hughes mansion with everything she had chosen and nothing she had been given. Behind her, the estate continued as though she had never been inside it. The man on the road had white hair, and he was 27 years old. Edward had not always looked like this. Once he had been the second son of a marquis, top-ranked at the Noble Academy, and the closest friend of the 3rd Prince's personal guard. He had a skill called sense enhancement that made him impossible to surprise. He had everything a young knight could want. He also had a best friend named James. James framed him for the attempted assassination of the 3rd Prince. The evidence was fabricated, a false witness, a planted letter, a timeline that only worked if you did not look too closely. Edward was arrested by colleagues who had eaten dinner with him the night before. He stood trial, acquitted for insufficient evidence, which meant nothing. Acquittal is not innocence in the eyes of people who have already chosen a side. He was expelled from the Knight Order. The prince's guard closed ranks as though he had never been inside. Then, his father made a choice. The Marquis had the exonerating evidence. He suppressed it. The political cost of defending an accused knight outweighed the cost of losing a second son he had already written off. Edward did not beg. He stole everything of value he could carry from the family estate and the Knight Order, sold the prince's gifted sword, and left the capital before anyone decided whether to stop him. His hair turned white over the months that followed. Not overnight, but in patches, then streaks, then fully, like a season changing. He became a swindler. He moved from town to town and did not allow himself to care about anything, because caring was how James had gotten inside him in the first place. He was walking to the next town when he saw a small girl on the road ahead, moving at a steady pace with a wagon and an improbable line of livestock following her in neat formation. He told himself not to interfere. He interfered. The girl was making stew. She had built a fire with impressive speed, Edward noted this, and was stirring a pot she appeared to have created from the ground itself. The stew smelled like hot water with ambitions. Edward approached with the posture of a man who happened to be passing by and was mildly curious, which was a lie in every particular. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Cooking," she said. "I am hungry." He introduced himself as a traveling merchant. She told him her name was Sylvia Hughes, and Edward felt the ground shift. Hughes was the Duke's family. He looked at the child, 7, alone, cooking something no reasonable person would eat, and asked where she was going. A fortress, given to her. She showed him the contract, and the signature was genuine. He asked for some food. She served it. He tasted it. It was the worst thing he had ever put in his mouth, and he had eaten prison food. He reached into his own bag, pulled out dried meat and seasoning, and without a word began remaking her stew into something a person could survive. She tasted the result. Her eyes widened, the first visible emotion he had seen from her. "You are a genius," she said. Edward used his sense enhancement to scan the perimeter. No guards, no escort, no adults. This child was completely alone on a road she could not defend. He offered to accompany her to the next town. She accepted. He told himself there were practical reasons. Her magic could produce nearly anything. Her contract meant legal standing. Solid, transactional, defensible reasons to walk beside her for a few more miles. They walked through the next day, and Edward made the mistake of listening. Sylvia told her story the way she did everything, without decoration, without self-pity, without any awareness that what she was describing was monstrous. She had been set down by her family and not picked up again. No beatings, no locked rooms, just an absence so total it became her normal. Edward regretted hearing it. It lodged somewhere behind his ribs and would not leave. Her magic, meanwhile, was absurd. She tapped the ground with a stick and produced a cooking stove. She killed a monster with a slingshot, called it pest control, and added the magic to her reserves without breaking stride. When he asked why they had not encountered bandits, she told him she had a spell called crime prevention, and her tone suggested this was obvious. At dusk, she created a camp from nothing, cleared ground, a shelter, grass for the livestock, a water source. Edward watched this and understood that this child was the most underestimated person in the kingdom. He cooked. She produced bowls by tapping the ground with frantic enthusiasm. "You are a genius," she said for the second time. "Stop calling me that," he said. After dinner, she fell asleep on his lap. Not in the shelter, not with the livestock. She curled into the space beside his leg, put her head on his knee, and was unconscious within 30 seconds. Edward sat very still and had a long conversation with himself about the practical advantages of her magic and the strategic value of a fortress. None of those reasons were the real reason. He knew this. They reached the next town faster than Edward expected. The livestock were not tired. The chickens were keeping pace as though this were a morning stroll, and he noticed it in himself. No fatigue, no aching legs, no hunger beyond the normal kind. He asked Sylvia. Her domination spell, she said. Those who acknowledged her as leader received its benefits. No exhaustion, increased strength. "When did I acknowledge you as my leader?" he said. It was not a question. "You stayed." She looked up at him. That was enough. The magic had been working on him since the campfire, since the stew, since the moment he decided, without saying the word, that he was not leaving yet. He asked whether her voice could reach him anywhere. She said it could. He asked whether the livestock would ignore her call. They would not, she said, because they trusted her. She looked at him with those calm gray-blue eyes and said that he would not ignore her either. Edward patted her head once and said nothing. Then, because the muscle memory of a knight does not die, no matter how many times a man insists it has, he knelt. One knee on the dirt road, head inclined, the posture he had used before the third prince. He offered Sylvia a formal noble greeting, half mocking and entirely sincere. Sylvia stared at him. "You are a genius," she said, for the third time. Edward sighed, lifted her with one arm, and kept walking. Gina had been walking for 2 days, and she was beginning to understand what freedom tasted like. It tasted like dust and uncertainty, and the absence of a ceiling she had spent her whole life pressing against. She had survived a carriage accident as a child, the one that killed both her parents. A family took her in. They said she was one of theirs. They were lying, but it took years to learn the grammar of that lie, because it was dressed in warm meals, and the word family used just often enough to keep her still. She sewed. She became the backbone of the workshop. Her hands were precise, her patience the kind that only grows in someone who has learned that complaining changes nothing. The workshop family took credit for her talent and called it gratitude. Their son Kyle grew up beside her, and the family joked about them marrying someday, and Gina did not understand until much later that the joke was a leash, designed to keep her working without the inconvenience of actually committing to her. When Kyle got engaged to a merchant's daughter named Kay, the architecture became visible. Kay wanted Gina gone. The family wanted her hands, but not her presence. She was labor, not family. She had always been labor. Her uncle Cosmo had tried for years to reach her. The workshop family blocked every attempt. She did not know he was still searching. Gina went to Kay, the woman who hated her most, and asked for help leaving. Kay gave her money, supplies, and a cold instruction to disappear before morning. Gina picked up her uncle's old magic bag, the one Kyle had thrown at her crumpled and damaged, and walked out. 2 towns later, she saw a small girl in a traveling cloak walking ahead of a wagon loaded with livestock, accompanied by a tall, white-haired man who looked like he was trying very hard not to care about anything. Gina approached with the caution of a person who has recently learned that the world does not arrange itself for her benefit. She asked whether she could travel with them. She could not afford a carriage, could not ride one even if she could, because the accident that killed her parents had never fully left her body. Edward found her suspicious. Her clothes were simple but well made. Her hands were a worker's hands, but her posture suggested something else. Sylvia looked at her for a moment. "You may come with us. I am the leader." That was the entire vetting process. They walked together. When they stopped to rest, Gina made a mistake that would become a running joke for weeks. She looked at Edward and Sylvia side by side and said, with genuine warmth, "Your father seems very capable." Edward's expression curdled. "I am not her father," he said. "Oh," Gina winced. "Her older brother? I am 27. Her uncle?" Sylvia was watching this with something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Then she tapped the ground with her staff and produced a stone cooking stove from the earth. Gina went still. She stared at the stove, at the staff, at the place where solid stone had not existed a moment before. Edward leaned toward her. "She is a duke's daughter. The magic is real." Gina bowed her head. "I am sorry for not believing." Sylvia straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has never once doubted her own assessment of herself, "I am great." Edward exhaled through his nose. Gina covered her mouth, and something in the air between the 3 of them shifted, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that a door opens when no one is paying attention to the hinges. The last town before the fortress was small and tired, and exactly the kind of place where a journey ends. This was where Edward had planned to stop. Each time a town arrived, he told himself it was the last. The fortress was her problem. He had no stake in a ruin. He had been clear about this to himself repeatedly, with diminishing conviction. Gina was having the same conversation by a different route. She could find work here. Her hands could sew anything. She could start over. But the something she kept thinking about was not a workshop. It was a small girl who made stoves from dirt and had never, in the days Gina had known her, asked anyone for anything. They sat across from each other in the tavern that evening and spoke about the road, the weather, the quality of the ale. Nothing that mattered. Then Gina said quietly, "She will be alone if we both leave." Edward looked at his cup. "She was alone before we arrived." "That is not the same thing," he did not answer. They both knew what they were going to do. The decision had already been made. It was waiting for them to stop pretending otherwise. The next morning, Sylvia stood at the town gate with her wagon and her livestock and the calm expression of someone who had already accepted every possible outcome. She asked them what they would do next. They hesitated. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had expected, thanked them, and began to walk. She did not ask them to come. She did not look back. Edward watched her go. The silver blonde hair, the small cloak, the pig trotting beside her with an air of absolute loyalty. A 7-year-old and her improbable procession, heading toward a ruin she intended to turn into a home, and she had not asked a single person to help. Gina moved first. She ran, caught up to Sylvia, dropped to one knee, and asked, her voice uneven, whether Sylvia would employ her at the fortress. She could sew. She could clean. She needed a place that was safe, and this was the safest thing she had found. Edward stood at the gate for 3 more seconds. Then he walked forward, knelt beside Gina, and offered his services as a guard. He cited his former experience as a knight. His voice was steady and dry and certain, which was strange because he had not been certain about anything in months. Sylvia turned around. She stared at them, both of them, kneeling on a dirt road in front of a 7-year-old with a pig, and her eyes went wide with unguarded shock. Gina laughed. Edward felt something in his chest crack, not break, crack, the way ice cracks when something warm presses against it from below. "Why are you laughing?" Sylvia asked. Her voice was small. Gina wiped her eyes. "Your face. You should see your face right now." Sylvia told them the fortress was empty. She could not pay a salary. There was nothing there. No staff, no supplies, no certainty the building had a roof. They told her they knew. Sylvia looked at them. She looked at the road ahead and the road behind. 2 people kneeling in the dust who had no reason to stay and had stayed anyway. And then she smiled. It was small. It arrived slowly, the way dawn arrives. Not a burst, but a brightening. A shift in the quality of light that changed everything without announcing itself. The first genuine smile she had worn in her life. It was not dramatic. It meant everything. Gina's breath caught. Edward looked away, at the road, at the sky, at anything that was not a 7-year-old girl smiling at him for the first time. They started walking. Nobody said the word stay. Nobody needed to. The fortress was ahead. The past was behind. And for the first time since any of them could remember, the direction they were moving in felt like forward. The fortress appeared through the trees, stone walls rising above the canopy, towers capped with weathered slate, the whole structure sitting on the far side of a moat that caught the morning light and held it still. Sylvia stopped walking. Behind her, the cow stopped too. Even the pig went quiet. Edward studied the walls for a long time, counting things she could not see. "The drawbridge is up," he said finally. It was. The heavy wooden bridge hung vertical against the gate, its chain rusted to the color of dried blood. No one had lowered it in years. Sylvia did not wait for suggestions. She walked to the edge of the moat, looked up at the chain, and reached for her magic the way a person reaches for a door handle. The fortress felt her. The enchantments buried in the stone, dormant for a generation, recognized something in her magic and woke up. The chain groaned. The drawbridge descended, slow and protesting, shedding rust in orange clouds. It landed with a sound that shook the ground. Edward caught her before she hit the dirt. She had collapsed, eyes shut, body limp, all the color gone from her face. The ownership spell had emptied her completely. Every drop of mana she had built over 3 days of walking and weeding, gone in a single act of claiming. He carried her across the drawbridge. The moment they were inside, the bridge rose again on its own, the chain pulling taut, sealing them in. The fortress had accepted its new owner. It was not going to let anyone else decide who entered. The corridor inside was dark and smelled like wet stone. Doors opened ahead of them without being touched, one after another, swinging wide as Edward carried Sylvia deeper into the fortress. "The whole building is obeying her," Gina whispered. "She is not even awake." He found the Lord's chamber, collapsed bed frame, shattered glass, dust thick enough to write in. He set Sylvia down and stepped back. She opened her eyes. "I need to weed," she said. "You need to rest. Weeding is resting." She sat up and steadied herself with one hand on the floor. "Every weed I pull is a monster defeated. Every monster defeated gives me mana back." She was already standing, walking past him toward the courtyard, barefoot and pale and not interested in being argued with. They followed her outside and started pulling weeds. By evening, the Lord's chamber looked like it belonged in a different building. Sylvia had used her renovation magic. One careful burst that smoothed the walls, replaced rotted floorboards, and restored the bed. Then she had collapsed again. She woke to the smell of food. Edward had cleaned the kitchen by hand and cooked from their remaining supplies: bread, eggs, a broth from dried provisions. The smell pulled Sylvia upright like a string attached to her nose. "Edward is a genius," she said. She said this often. She meant it every time. He watched her eat, efficiently, enthusiastically, with no regard for the tablecloth Gina had laid down. When she finished, he folded his arms. "You have collapsed twice today. This is not sustainable." Sylvia tilted her head. "I recovered both times. By weeding. Weeding works. What happens when there are no weeds left?" She considered this. "Then I will find something else to defeat. Insects. Rats. There will always be something." Edward pinched the bridge of his nose. Gina covered her mouth to hide a smile. That night, Sylvia insisted all three sleep in the restored bed. Edward objected. Sylvia told him the corridor had not been renovated yet and was full of spiders. He slept in the bed. He lay on the far edge with his sword within reach, listening to Sylvia's breathing settle into the rhythm of deep sleep. He thought about the fortress. He thought about James, about how trust was the most dangerous thing a person could offer. Then Sylvia shifted in her sleep, and her small hand found his sleeve. She held on without waking. He did not move. He did not sleep for a long time, but he did not move. The first days had a rhythm. Edward trained before dawn: sword forms, footwork, conditioning. He had not trained properly in months, and his body remembered every gap. But the muscle memory was deeper than the rust, and each morning he found a little more of the night buried under the swindler. Gina mapped the fortress room by room, making lists, making plans. She recruited the cow for moral support during inspections of the darker corridors. Sylvia renovated, one room per day, stopping before complete exhaustion. Edward's rule, enforced with the authority of a man who had carried her unconscious twice in one day and refused to do it a third time. The stables came first. She touched the nearest wall and the magic rippled outward. Broken beams straightened. Stalls rebuilt themselves from the inside out. The livestock moved in before the dust settled. The pig claimed the largest stall. The cow took the one with the best light. The chickens scattered with the decisive efficiency of creatures who have never doubted their own importance. Gina reported to Edward that Sylvia was weeding simultaneously with the renovations. She says the renovation and the weeding cancel out. That is not how energy works. It is how her energy works. Then Sylvia created the mystery meat, a lump of pinkish, translucent substance that smelled like nothing and looked like a question nobody wanted to answer. She was proud of it. Edward confiscated it. "You are not eating this. I will cook actual food." "But I made it." "You made something. I am not convinced it is food." Gina took it before the argument could escalate. It was not fine, but they did not tell Sylvia that. On the fourth day, they stood on the outer wall and looked at what lay beyond. Grassland rolled to the edge of a town, not large, but real. Beyond it, farms stretched toward a river, and beyond the river, nothing. Edward noted the outer wall was lower than the back wall. The fortress had been built expecting attacks from the duchy's direction, not from the frontier. Sylvia looked at the town. "People live there." "They do. They are mine now." She said it without arrogance, a fact already decided. "We should go to town." The mayor was an old man with hands that shook when he set down his teacup. He looked at the 7-year-old sitting across from him in a chair too large for her body, at the white-haired man standing behind her, at the young woman in a maid's uniform by the door, and he said the only thing he had left. "My lady, the city is dying." He told them everything. The bridge connecting the fortress city to the duchy had collapsed years ago. Without it, trade died, businesses closed, people left. Those who stayed had nowhere else to go. He had sent requests to the duchy for repairs every year for 12 years. None had been answered. Edward asked specific questions about the timeline, the correspondence, the duchy's responses. With each answer, something in his expression hardened. In the corridor outside, he stopped walking. The bridge was not neglected. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he was certain. It was destroyed, deliberately. The duchy stopped responding the same year the bridge fell. They wanted this city to empty out so they could reclaim the territory. Gina stared at him. Her own family? Her family did not exile just her. He looked toward the town gate, toward people moving through streets that had been slowly strangled for over a decade. They exiled an entire city. The mayor gathered every resident in the central square. He had told them that if anyone was absent, the repairs would not happen. In a city where isolation meant death, that threat had the weight of scripture. They came, all of them, fishermen, shopkeepers, old women, young families, craftsmen without customers, farmers whose fields reached a river no one could cross. They looked at the platform and saw a 7-year-old girl. Sylvia did not look nervous. She studied the crowd the way Edward studied fortress walls, counting. But she was counting something different. She was counting the people who belonged to her now. The mayor introduced her with her full title. The crowd murmured, "A child." Most of them looked like people who had stopped expecting anything a long time ago. She did not give a speech. She reached for her magic. The ownership spell moved through the square like a wave. Not violent, not coercive, but undeniable. Every person felt it pass through them, warm. The recognition of a bond, a claim made not by force, but by declaration. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then an old fisherman near the back said something, and the people around him laughed, not cruelly, but with the startled relief of people who had just been told that someone was coming. "I will fix the bridge," Sylvia said. Her voice carried across the square, clear and small and absolute. The cheering did not stop for a long time. The bridge was worse than Edward had described. The stone pilings were shattered in a pattern that spoke of deliberate force, not erosion, not age. Someone had taken this bridge apart on purpose. The gap was wide, the river fast, the far bank overgrown. Sylvia stood at the edge. Behind her, half the city had followed them to the river, standing at a distance that said they wanted to believe but had not committed to it. "The bridge was destroyed," she said. A fact, not an accusation. But the fact landed on the mayor like a physical blow. He had suspected for years. Hearing it from the daughter of the family that ordered it was something else. She knelt and placed both hands on the broken stone. She closed her eyes. The magic built slowly this time. Not the instant burst of the fortress claim, but a sustained, careful push. Stone rose from the riverbed. Fragments pulled together, finding their original positions like puzzle pieces under patient hands. The pilings rebuilt from the foundation up. The span grew outward from both banks simultaneously, reaching toward the center with the slow certainty of something that had always been meant to connect. It took time. The crowd watched in silence. Edward watched Sylvia's breathing, steady, controlled. Nothing like the wild expenditure that had collapsed her at the fortress gate. She had learned. She was pacing herself. The two halves met in the center, the stone sealed, the surface smooth. Then she did something no one had asked for. She made the bridge movable, a mechanism in the center span that allowed it to retract toward the city's bank, leaving a gap too wide to cross. A defensive measure, controlled from the city side. She stood up, pale but standing. Lower it at sunrise, raise it at sunset. The bridge answers to this city now, not to the duchy. The mayor's hands were shaking, not from age this time. The crowd surged forward onto the bridge, touching it, crossing it for the first time in over a decade. On the far bank, border officials stared at the sudden traffic with the blank confusion of people who had forgotten this road existed. Edward watched Sylvia walk back. She was not smiling, but there was something in her expression he had not seen before. Satisfaction, quiet, private, the kind that does not need an audience. He filed the moment away. He filed a lot of things away when it came to her. That evening, Edward came to Sylvia's chamber. His posture was different. The deliberate slouch was gone. He stood the way he had been trained to stand, the coiled readiness of a knight who has stopped pretending he is not one. Sylvia was sitting on the edge of her bed, feet dangling above the floor. She looked up at him. Edward knelt. No audience beyond Gina in the doorway. No ceremony. Just a man on one knee in a firelit room, looking up at a child who had rebuilt a bridge that afternoon. "I offer my sword and my service." The words were formal, the oath he had spoken once before to a prince who did not deserve them. But the voice was different. The voice belonged to a man who had stopped believing this arrangement was practical, somewhere between the drawbridge and the bridge. "I will be your shield when you need one. I will be your blade when the time comes. I will not leave." Sylvia looked at him. She said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she held out her hand, small, steady, and the contract magic sealed around them both, warm, permanent. Edward felt it settle into his chest like a second heartbeat, and he understood that this was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Not the fights, not the betrayals, choosing to stay. Gina waited until he stepped aside. Then she knelt in the same place. "I will stay," she said, "for as long as you will have me. Not because I owe you, because I want to be here." The contract sealed faster this time, as if the magic already knew what Gina meant. Edward muttered something about the difference in speed. Gina gave him a look that could have peeled paint. Sylvia made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then the room was quiet again. Sylvia sat on the edge of her bed with 2 contracts humming in her chest. 2 people bound to her by choice, not obligation. 2 people who had knelt and chosen to stay, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because the bridge had risen and they had understood what she was. She did not cry. She did not give a speech. She looked at Edward, then at Gina, and said the thing she always said when she did not have words for what she was feeling. "Edward is a genius," she said softly, "and Gina is a genius too." Edward looked at the ceiling. Gina wiped her eyes. The fire crackled. Outside, the fortress settled around them. Stone walls, ancient enchantments, a drawbridge that answered to a 7-year-old girl. Beyond the walls, a city was breathing for the first time in 12 years. Beyond the city, a bridge connected it to the world again, retractable and defended, answering to no one but the child who had built it. Sylvia pulled her feet up onto the bed and lay down. She was asleep within a minute, the deep, unguarded sleep of someone who has been given proof that she is worth staying for. She did not know this yet, but the proof was there, sealed in magic and kneeling in firelight, and it was not going anywhere. The priest arrived on a Tuesday, veiled and unhurried, as though the fortress had been expecting him. Sylvia was in the courtyard supervising the latest round of servant assignments when the gate guard announced a visitor. "A clergyman," he said, "young, here to greet the Lord." Edward was beside her before the guard finished the sentence, one hand resting on his belt where the sword used to hang before he started carrying it openly again. The priest introduced himself simply. He had come from the town church to pay respects to the new Lord. Edward told him his respects had been received and he could leave. The priest did not leave. Instead, he removed the thin veil from his face and the courtyard went quiet. He was, by any honest measure, the most beautiful person any of them had ever seen. Fine-boned, dark-haired, pale in the way of someone who spent his days indoors with incense and scripture. His features were not handsome in the way Edward was handsome. They were something closer to impossible. Even Gina took a visible step back. Sylvia looked at him the way she looked at bridges and livestock, with interest, but no particular alarm. "Can you do things?" she asked. The priest blinked. "I need someone who can command the servants," Sylvia continued. "Gina has been doing it alone, and she is tired. Can you do that?" Edward's jaw tightened. The priest studied the 7-year-old for a long moment, and then something shifted behind his eyes. He knelt, took her small hand, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "I will serve you as steward," he said, "and continue to serve God, if you will permit both." Edward pulled Sylvia's hand free. "Wash that," he said flatly. He turned to the priest with an expression that was not a smile. "Touch her again, and I will solve the servant problem permanently." Sylvia wiped her hand on her cloak, unbothered. "His name is Cole," she announced, though no one had told her that. "He stays." That night, after Cole had been shown to his quarters and given a room near the small chapel, Edward stood by the fireplace and said nothing for a long time. Gina finally broke the silence. "He is actually good at the job. That is the problem." "Edward," he turned. The firelight made his white hair look almost golden. "A priest does not walk into a fortress and offer to manage servants, not unless he is running from something or towards something. Either way, I do not like what it means." Sylvia was already on the bed, legs tucked beneath her, watching them with the patient attention of a child who had learned early that adults said interesting things when they thought she was not listening. "He looked at me strangely," she said. Edward's eyes sharpened. "Strangely how? Like I was clean." She considered the word. "Like everything else was dirty and I was not." Edward and Gina exchanged a glance. Edward filed the observation somewhere behind his expression and said nothing further about it that night. But Gina noticed he did not leave Sylvia's room to sleep. He sat in the chair by the door, sword across his lap, and stayed until morning. 3 nights later, Gina found Edward alone in the kitchen, staring into a bowl of stew he was not eating. She sat across from him. "You first," she said. "You have been carrying something since the day he arrived." Edward's mouth thinned. He did not deny it. He told her the shape of what had happened to him. Not every detail, not the prince's name or the city, but the structure, a friend he would have died for, a frame he did not see coming, an arrest by men who knew he was innocent and chose convenience, a father who burned the evidence rather than spend the political capital to save his own son. His voice did not waver. He told it the way a man describes directions to a place he no longer visits. Left at the bridge, right at the old mill. The ruins are on the hill past the orchard. He did not say he was hurt. He said, I stole everything I could carry and left. Gina listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. My turn, she said. Her story was slower. The carriage accident she barely survived. The workshop family that took her in, fed her, told her she was one of them. The years of labor. The way they sold her parents' belongings piece by piece while telling her they were keeping them safe. The son who wanted her to remain permanently available, unmarried, grateful, useful. She paused when she reached the end. His fiancée was the one who helped me leave. She gave me money and told me to disappear. I think she saw what they were doing and could not stomach it, even though she was marrying into it. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and set his hand briefly on top of her head. You survived people who were supposed to love you. That is harder than surviving enemies. Gina's eyes went bright. She wiped them with her sleeve and sat up straighter. I had an uncle, she said, almost as an afterthought. My mother's brother. He used to come looking for me when I was small, but the workshop family always turned him away, and after a while, he stopped coming. She frowned. Or I assumed he stopped. I do not actually know. Edward's expression did not change, but Gina would learn much later that he had already begun filing that detail away in the part of his mind that never stopped working. Neither of them noticed Cole standing in the corridor outside the kitchen, close enough to hear, choosing not to enter. The next morning, Sylvia walked into the chapel while Cole was praying and sat on the bench nearest the altar. She waited until he finished. She did not fidget or grow impatient. She simply sat, hands folded, watching the dust move in the colored light. When Cole turned to face her, she asked, "Why did you really come here?" He studied her. The question was not hostile. It was the question of someone who had learned that people rarely said the true reason first and had decided to skip to the second attempt. Cole pointed to the short wooden rod she carried everywhere. He had owned that staff once, he said, years ago. It had been given to him to help control a skill he carried, but it overwhelmed him instead. It sealed his abilities entirely. He could not use it. She wielded it as though it were nothing. Sylvia held the staff up and looked at it. It breathes, she said, like me. It takes magic in and lets it out. I just showed it how. Cole's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read. He had expected to find a child. He had found something else. He knelt again, this time without reaching for her hand, and said he would serve her for as long as she permitted. Sylvia accepted this the way she accepted most things, as though it were obvious. Edward did not trust obvious things. Over the following week, he sent 3 letters through a contact he had maintained from his night order days. The contact operated across the border and charged a fee Edward paid without complaint. The first response came back in 4 days. Cole had been found in a river, rescued by townspeople, claimed amnesia, taken in by the church, became a priest by choice. Background unverifiable because the neighboring country's records were sealed. Edward burned the report. None of this explained why a priest who had spent years hiding inside a town church had suddenly walked into a fortress and offered to manage a 7-year-old's household. The second response arrived 2 days later. Church records suggesting Cole matched a minor noble's child who had gone missing years earlier from the neighboring country, reported dead after falling into a river. Body never recovered. Edward burned that one too. The third response took a full week. When it arrived, Edward read it standing up, and he did not sit down for a long time afterward. The report was detailed. Cole was born the illegitimate son of Marquis Aldrich in the neighboring country. His mother, a dancer, had died in childbirth. Aldrich had arranged for the child to be adopted by Lord Ellis, a viscount with a kind reputation. The boy grew up sheltered, beautiful beyond reason, and constantly targeted. People tried to take him, not once, not occasionally, multiple times a month. To protect himself, the boy had been given a skill. The report did not name it precisely, but Edward's contact described it as the ability to perceive wrongdoing. The boy could see, on every person he encountered, the weight and color of what they had done. At 10 years old, Marquis Aldrich had arranged for the boy to study under the judicial chief. It was meant to launch a career in the judiciary. Instead, the judicial chief cornered him alone in a private chamber and intended to harm him. The boy kicked free. He ran. He reached a river and jumped. He survived. He pretended not to remember who he was. He became a priest. He had been hiding ever since. Edward set the report on the desk and watched the candle flicker. He understood now. Cole had a skill that let him see sin. Edward's own past was dense with it. Every swindle, every theft, every lie he had told in the years after James destroyed him. Cole had looked at Edward and seen all of it, written in blood red across his body, and had decided that the man standing next to the sinless child was a monster. Cole was wrong, but Edward could not explain that without revealing things he had no intention of revealing. What he could do was calculate. Cole's real identity was a secret that powerful people had reason to keep buried. The judicial chief was still in power. If word reached him that a strikingly beautiful young priest had surfaced in the neighboring country, the response would not be a letter. It would be a team of men who solved problems quietly and permanently, and those men would come to the fortress. Edward opened a drawer and took out a map of the grounds. Cole was not sleeping well. He had listened to Edward and Gina share their past through the kitchen doorway, and what he heard had complicated things. The woman's story was clean. She had suffered. She had escaped. She had chosen to serve. There was nothing in her that troubled him. Edward was a different equation. His sins were visible to Cole every time they occupied the same room. The letters hung on him like wet cloth, dark red and layered deep. Deception, fraud, theft, manipulation. They were the sins of a man who had spent years taking from others and telling himself it was justified. But the story Edward had told Gina did not match a predator's confession. It matched a man who had been destroyed and had rebuilt himself badly. Cole understood the difference. He simply could not reconcile it with what his skill showed him. Gina found him in the corridor late one evening, standing with his back against the stone wall and his eyes closed. "You look terrible," she said. He opened his eyes. "I am praying. You are brooding. I know the difference." She folded her arms. "You have been strange since you arrived, and Edward has been stranger. Whatever is between you two, it is affecting the household." Cole's expression softened slightly. "You are perceptive. I spent years reading the moods of people who were lying to me. It is not a skill I asked for, but it works." She paused. "If you need to talk, I am here. Not as a congregant, as a colleague." He thanked her. He declined. He watched her walk away, and he thought about the uncle she had mentioned, the one who had searched for her and been turned away. He wondered, briefly, whether that man was still looking. It was the kind of thought Cole had often, small, persistent, filed away among the sins of everyone he had ever met. He returned to his room and did not sleep. Edward walked the battlements at dusk with the map folded in his coat. He had spent the day asking Sylvia, casually, to reinforce certain walls, to set her magic into the stone around the servant entrance, to extend the fortress's defensive awareness to the back gate. She had done all of it cheerfully, because Edward asked and because she trusted him completely. She did not ask why. She never asked why. She simply did what made sense when the person she trusted said it made sense. He hated that about her, not the trust, the way it made him feel responsible for what the trust would cost. The wind picked up. From the battlements, he could see the road that led south toward the border. Somewhere on the other side of that border, in an office that smelled of ink and consequence, a man who had tried to destroy a 10-year-old boy was reading a report about a beautiful priest. And that man was reaching for the instrument he always reached for when a problem needed to disappear. Edward did not know the judicial chief's name. He did not need to. He knew the type. He had served men like that in the Night Order. Men whose sins were administrative, whose violence was delegated, whose hands stayed clean because they paid other hands to get dirty. The assassins were already moving. Edward was certain of it. The timing was wrong for anything else. The bridge was rebuilt. The city was visible again. And Cole's face was the kind of face that generated rumors across borders. Edward leaned against the parapet and looked down at the courtyard below. Sylvia was chasing a chicken that had escaped the coop, her silver hair catching the last of the light. Gina was laughing. Cole was standing in the chapel doorway, watching Sylvia with an expression that Edward recognized because he wore it himself. The expression of someone who had decided, without quite meaning to, that this child was worth the danger that was coming. The difference between them was simple. Cole intended to protect Sylvia by watching Edward. Edward intended to protect Sylvia by killing everyone who came through the gate. He folded the map back into his coat and went inside to check the traps. The high priest summoned Cole the next morning. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and waited for Cole to sit. "They know," the high priest said, "or they will, shortly. Your history has attracted the kind of attention that does not ask questions before arriving." Cole went still. The bridge's reopening had drawn notice. Travelers were moving through, and with them came gossip. A priest of extraordinary beauty in the fortress city. It was not the kind of detail that stayed local. Cole said nothing for a long time. Then, "I will leave. If I go, they follow me and the fortress is safe." The high priest shook his head. "You will not leave, and we both know it. You decided to stay the moment you saw that child carry no sin. Running now would mean abandoning the only person you have ever met who does not make your skill feel like a punishment." Cole's composure cracked, just slightly. His hands pressed flat against his knees. "Then tell her," the high priest said. "Tell the knight. He's already investigating you. He probably knows more than you think. His sins are blood red, and yours," the high priest said quietly, "include a decade of lying to everyone who sheltered you. We are all carrying something." He paused. "I know who you were before the river. I have always known." Cole flinched. The high priest had never said it aloud before. He said it now the way a father invokes a child's full name when the conversation is no longer optional. "Edward is not the threat," the high priest said. "The man who sent you into that river is the threat, and he is coming. If you do not tell Edward what is coming, the people around that child will be unprepared." Cole stood. He bowed. He walked out of the study and into the morning light, and he did not tell Edward, not yet. Across the border, in a room Edward would never see, the judicial chief received a report confirming what he had suspected. A young priest of remarkable beauty, serving at a fortress church in the neighboring country. The age was right. The description was unmistakable. He summoned the operative he used for problems that required permanent solutions. The orders were brief. Find the priest, confirm his identity, eliminate him, leave no connection to the office. The operative assembled a team. They crossed the border on separate routes, carrying papers that identified them as merchants, pilgrims, tradesmen. They converged on the fortress city without speaking to each other until they were inside the walls. Edward, standing on the battlements that same night, did not know their names or how many there were, but he knew they were coming. The traps were set. The entry points were narrowed. The fortress's magic, laid into the stone by a 7-year-old who thought she was doing routine maintenance, would respond to hostile intent the way a living thing responds to a hand on its throat. Below him, the fortress slept. Sylvia in her chamber with the chicken that refused to stay in the coop. Gina in the room next door, her new short swords propped against the nightstand because Edward had insisted she learn to use them. Cole in the chapel, praying or brooding, the two activities indistinguishable from outside the door. Edward checked the service entrance one more time. The hinges were oiled. The corridor beyond it was long and narrow, with exactly 2 places where a man could stand unseen. He had placed things in both of those places. Things that would make noise if disturbed. Things that would make worse noises after that. He returned to his post by Sylvia's door, sat in the chair, and set his sword across his lap. The fortress waited with him. Cole had stayed late at the church again. It was not unusual. The high priest had gone to bed hours earlier, and Cole had remained in the nave with his hands folded on the altar rail, doing the thing he did every night, staring at the dark behind his closed eyes and trying not to think about the red he saw on Edward's soul. He had not found peace. He never did, but the ritual calmed him enough to walk back through the fortress without his hands shaking. He stepped through the service corridor and heard them before he saw them, breathing. Low, deliberate, trained breathing. The kind that comes from people who have been taught to move quietly but have not been taught to stop inhaling. Cole counted 3 distinct patterns, then a 4th. His barrier went up before his next heartbeat. The first strike came from the left, a blade, thin and fast, glancing off the shimmer of magic that wrapped his body like a second skin. The second was fire, a compact burst that hit the barrier and hissed into steam against the stone. Cole did not flinch. He had learned this magic at 10 years old, in a river, while a man who was supposed to protect him tried to end his life. The barrier held because it always always held, but his magic was not full. The day's work, healing, administrative blessings, the daily session on Gina's recovery had drained more than he had admitted. The barrier flickered at the edges. He had minutes, not hours. The assassins saw it too. There were 5 of them, pressed against the corridor walls, professional and unhurried. One of them smiled. He told Cole they had been sent to finish what should have been finished years ago. He named the judicial chief. Cole's stomach dropped, not because he was surprised, because he had known this was coming and had done nothing to prevent it. Gina came around the corner with 2 short swords drawn. She was barefoot. Her nightgown was tucked into her belt, and the blades in her hands were the ones Edward had given her 3 months ago. Plain, balanced, sharp enough to split a candle wick. She had heard the explosion of the fire spell from her room on the floor above. She had not gone to Sylvia first. She had not gone to find Edward. She had come here, toward the sound, because that was where the danger was. "Go," she said to Cole. Her voice was flat and final. "Find Edward. I will not leave you alone with them. You are out of magic." She did not look at him when she said it. She was looking at the 5 shapes in the corridor, measuring distance. "I am not out of anything." Cole opened his mouth to argue. Gina stepped past him and into the corridor's narrow center, where the torchlight caught the edges of her blades. "Go to Sylvia," Cole tried. "Sylvia has the enchantments." Gina's feet settled into the stance Edward had drilled into her over dozens of mornings in the courtyard. Low center, blades angled, weight on the back foot. She does not have anyone in this hallway. Cole's barrier cracked. A thin line of white ran through it like a fracture in glass. The assassins shifted forward. Gina moved first. The first assassin came low, expecting her to guard high. She did not. She dropped beneath his blade and drove her left sword through the gap in his leather guard. He went down without a sound. The second came from behind the first, using the body as a screen, and Gina pivoted. The turn was ugly, not the clean rotation Edward had taught her, but it worked. Her right blade caught him across the arm, and he pulled back. She had been trained to fight. She had not been trained to kill people. The difference was the hesitation that lived in the half second between cutting and driving the cut home. She felt it. The third assassin felt it too. He grinned at her. Then she heard Edward's voice in her memory. The morning he had put the swords in her hands for the first time. He had said, "If someone comes into this fortress to hurt Sylvia, you do not think, you do not negotiate, you finish it." Gina finished it. She killed the fire mage with a strike that ended the fight before his next spell could form. She killed the second wounded assassin with a spinning cut that sent him into the wall. The corridor was quiet for 1 full breath. The third assassin threw his dagger. It buried itself in Gina's side, below the ribs, and she folded. Her knees hit the stone. The swords clattered. She pressed her hand to the wound and felt heat. Not pain yet, just the sick, wet warmth that meant something important had been opened. Cole was on the ground behind her, magic spent, conscious but unable to move. The third assassin stepped over the bodies toward her. He drew a second blade. Edward came through the far door covered in blood that was not his own. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His spectacles were gone. His hair, white and wild, was stuck to his forehead with someone else's sweat, or someone else's worse. He moved with the coiled, explosive precision of a man who had stopped pretending he was not a knight. The assassin saw him and ran. Edward's hand swept the air. The wind obeyed. The assassin stumbled, cut across the back, and crashed through the service door. He locked it behind him with something metallic, and by the time Edward reached the door, the man was gone. Out through the rear passage, over the wall, into the dark beyond the fortress. Edward did not chase him. He turned and saw Gina on the floor. For 1 second, his face did something the narrator had never seen it do before. Then it was gone, replaced by the operational mask, and he was on his knees beside her, hands already moving. "How long?" he asked Cole. Cole's voice was barely audible. "Minutes. She fought 3 of them. She killed 2. Edward lifted Gina without a word. She was conscious. Her eyes were open and fixed on his face, with an expression that was half gratitude and half fury that he had not arrived sooner. He carried her out of the corridor and up the stairs, and the blood from her wound left a trail on every step behind them. Edward set Gina on the bed and went to work. His hands were precise. He had done this before, in the night order, in the field, on men who had taken worse and survived, and men who had taken less and had not. He cleaned the wound, assessed the depth, applied pressure in a pattern that came from muscle memory, so deep it did not require thought. Gina watched him without speaking. Her jaw was clenched. Her breathing was controlled. She had decided she was not going to scream, and she did not. He packed the wound, bound it, and moved to the burns on her shoulder where the fire spell had caught her. The skin was raw and angry. He treated it with the supplies he kept in a kit under his own bed. A kit he had never mentioned to anyone, because mentioning it would have meant admitting he expected this. "You should have stayed in your room," he said, without looking up. "You should have told me they were coming," Gina said. Edward's hands stopped for one beat. Then they resumed. He did not answer. Sylvia appeared in the doorway. She was in her nightgown, barefoot, her silver blonde hair tangled from sleep. A servant stood behind her, looking stricken. Sylvia's eyes went to the bed, to Gina's bandaged torso, to the blood on the sheets, to Edward's hands. Her face did something. It was not the face of a child who was scared. It was worse than that. It was the face of a child who understood exactly what had happened and was processing it at a speed no 7-year-old should be capable of. Then she cried. Not the loud, theatrical crying of a child who wants attention. The quiet, gasping, whole-body crying of someone who has just discovered that the people she chose can be taken from her. She climbed onto the bed without asking permission. She pressed herself against Gina's uninjured side and held on. Gina's hand came up, trembling, pale from blood loss, and rested on Sylvia's head. "I am here," Gina said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "I am right here." Edward stood and stepped back. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he turned to the servant and gave instructions. The attackers had been dealt with. The fortress was secure. The back entrance needed to be sealed. His voice was flat and functional. His face was not. The high priest arrived within the hour. He was old and moved slowly, but his hands were steady when he placed them over Gina's wound. The healing magic was limited. He said so plainly. The wound would close. The burns would fade, slowly, if treated daily. Full recovery was possible, but not guaranteed and not fast. He looked at Edward while he said this, and Edward looked back without blinking. "She needs daily healing sessions," the high priest said. "Cole's restoration magic is suited to this. His hands are the right ones." Edward's jaw tightened. The idea of relying on the man whose presence had brought the assassins to the fortress sat in his mouth like iron. But Gina was on the bed, and Sylvia was asleep against her shoulder, and there was no alternative that did not involve letting Gina scar. "Fine," Edward said. The high priest did not leave immediately. He waited until Edward had gone to wash the blood off his hands and change his ruined clothes. When Edward returned, clean, wearing a spare tunic, looking like a man who had not slept in 3 days, the high priest stopped him in the corridor outside. "You are easy to read," the high priest said. "For a man who spent years as a swindler, your face gives away everything you care about." Edward said nothing. "The boy with the sin-seeing eyes judges by the ledger. The ledger says you are stained." The high priest paused. He was watching Edward's hands, which were clenched at his sides. "Tell him to look at the pattern of your actions instead. The ledger records what you have done. The pattern shows who you have done it for." Edward still said nothing, but something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker, not of hope, but of the exhaustion that comes from being seen accurately by someone you did not ask to look. The high priest left. In the room, Sylvia had fallen asleep, curled against Gina's uninjured side. Her small hand was wrapped around Gina's fingers. Gina was awake, staring at the ceiling, breathing carefully around the pain. Cole woke in his own room with the high priest sitting beside his bed. He did not remember being carried there. The last thing he remembered was the corridor floor and the sound of Edward's boots moving away with Gina in his arms. "She is stable," the high priest said, before Cole could ask. "Edward's treatment was precise. She will recover." Cole flinched at Edward's name. The high priest saw it. "You blame him. He let them in." Cole's voice was hoarse. "The back entrance. He knew the layout. He knew when they were coming. He positioned himself at the other entry point. He used the fortress as a trap, and Gina walked into it." The high priest was quiet for a long time. "I told you," the high priest said finally, "to tell him your past. You refused. The danger came because your presence drew it, not because Edward opened a door." Cole opened his mouth, closed it. "You will heal Gina daily. You will apologize to Edward, and you will tell him everything. Your father, the judicial chief, the river, all of it." The high priest stood. "If you do not, the next wave will come, and you will not have Edward standing between it and this fortress. You will have yourself alone. with empty magic and a clear conscience. Ask yourself if that is enough. Cole stared at the wall. His hands were shaking, not from the magic exhaustion, from the thing the high priest had said about the ledger and the pattern. The same advice, reframed, aimed at Cole instead of Edward. The ledger said Edward was a sinner. The pattern said Edward had carried Gina up 3 flights of stairs with blood on his hands and fury on his face directed at the people who had hurt her. Cole was not ready to reconcile these, but the crack in his certainty was wider than it had been the night before. Cole found Edward the next morning in the corridor outside the Great Hall. Edward was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at nothing. He had not slept, that was obvious. The bruises under his eyes were dark enough to look painted. "We need to talk," Cole said. Edward considered ignoring him. Cole watched the consideration cross his face, the slight turn of the head, the half step toward walking away. Then Edward turned back, not out of respect, out of the recognition that avoidance was no longer functional. Cole's voice was controlled, measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this in his room for an hour before walking out. "You guided them in," Cole said. "You knew they were coming. You positioned yourself at the inner entrance and let the others come through the back. You used this fortress as a killing floor." Edward's expression did not change. "Gina is lying in bed with a wound that will take weeks to heal and burns that may scar for life." Cole's control was slipping at the edges. "That is the cost of your plan." "My plan," Edward said quietly, "handled the second group before they reached the main hall. 5 of them. All of them are dead. Sylvia never woke up. And Gina?" Edward's jaw moved. A muscle in his cheek flexed. "Gina was not supposed to be in that corridor," he said. "She was supposed to stay in her room. She heard the fight and came to help. That is what Gina does." Cole stepped closer. "You knew that about her. You know everything about everyone in this fortress. You calculated every variable except the one where the people you claim to protect act like people instead of pieces on your board." Edward said nothing for a long time. The sunlight moved across the floor between them. "You are not wrong," Edward said. His voice was very quiet. It was the voice of a man who had already convicted himself of everything Cole was accusing him of hours before Cole arrived. Then he pushed off the wall and walked away. Cole called after him. Edward did not turn. Edward came to Gina's room that evening. She was asleep. The bandages had been changed. Cole had come by earlier to apply his healing, and Gina had let him without comment. Her face was pale against the pillow. Her breathing was shallow, but even. Edward stood beside the bed for a long time. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He looked at the bandages on her torso and the raw skin on her shoulder where the burns were still angry, and his hands, the hands that had carried her, treated her, packed and bound the wound, hung at his sides like they did not know what to do when there was nothing left to fix. "I am sorry," he said to the room. Gina did not stir. He had timed this precisely. He knew her sleep patterns, because he knew everyone's sleep patterns, because that was the kind of man he was. He left the room and closed the door behind him. Sylvia was in the bed. She had crawled in sometime after dinner. Gina had told her she could stay, and Sylvia had not needed to be told twice. She was curled on her side, one small hand still wrapped around Gina's fingers, her silver blonde hair spread across the pillow. She was breathing the deep, slow breath of a child in absolute sleep. She did not know what had happened in the corridor. She did not know what Edward had planned or what it had cost. She knew only that Gina was hurt, and that if she held on tightly enough, the holding might matter. Edward knelt beside the bed. He was quiet. His breathing was quiet. The fortress around him was quiet. The servants asleep. Cole in his room. The high priest in the church. The animals settled in the courtyard. The only sound was Sylvia's breathing and the faint pop of the candle wick drowning in its own wax. He reached out and placed his hand over Sylvia's. It was small enough that his palm covered her fingers entirely. He held it for 3 breaths. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her hair. He stayed there for a moment. Not long, not dramatic. Not the farewell of a man who wanted to be seen leaving. The farewell of a man who did not want to leave at all. He whispered something. The narrator does not report what it was. He stood. He picked up his traveling bag from beside the door, already packed, already prepared, because Edward was always already prepared. He walked through the corridor, down the stairs, past the sealed service entrance, through the main gate. The fortress did not stop him. The enchantments he had helped install recognized his intent and let him pass. The night swallowed him. Sylvia slept. Gina slept. Cole, in his room, stared at the ceiling and did not. In the morning, the fortress would discover that Edward was gone. Sylvia would cry, the kind of crying that would reach him wherever he was, because the domination bond carried her grief like a wire strung between them, taut and singing. He would feel it. He would keep walking. That was the cost. He had calculated it. He had accepted it. He had not been ready for what it actually felt like. No one is ever ready for that. Sylvia woke with her hand still resting on Gina's arm. The room was quiet. The bandages across Gina's midsection had been changed sometime in the night, the linen fresh and white against her skin. Her breathing was steady, even in sleep. Gina held herself the way she always did, jaw set, shoulders braced, ready. Sylvia sat up slowly. She looked at the empty doorway. She knew before she checked. Something was missing. Not a sound, not a smell. Something deeper, a weight that had been in the fortress since the day they arrived. A presence she had never named because it had simply been there, the way gravity was there. She climbed off the bed and walked barefoot down the corridor. Edward's room was empty. The bed was made. His leather bag was gone. His coat was gone. The spectacles he kept on the nightstand were not there. Nothing remained except the faint impression in the pillow where his head had been, and even that was fading. Sylvia stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not cry the way she had cried when she saw Gina's blood. That had been loud, gasping, the kind of crying that comes when the body understands something before the mind does. This was different. She walked to the center of the room, sat down on the stone floor with her knees drawn up, and said nothing. She stayed there for what might have been an hour. The maid who found her said Edward would come back soon. Sylvia did not answer. The maid brought a blanket. Sylvia did not move. Eventually, the maid left, and the corridor was quiet again, and the 7-year-old girl sat on the cold floor of the room where her night had slept and waited for something she could not name to stop hurting. It did not stop. Cole did not sleep properly for 4 days. He managed Gina's healing sessions every morning and evening. He handled the city's administrative requests, the servants' questions, the meal rotations, the wall inspections. At night, he stood his patrol alone, back gate, service entrance, outer wall, bridge mechanism, carrying a lantern in one hand and his barrier magic in the other, walking until his legs ached and then walking further. He knew the second wave was coming. The escaped assassin had reported back. The only question was when. On the second night, he tried to raise the back gate's bridge. Sylvia refused. She shook her head once without speaking. She would not close the gate Edward had left through. Cole moved his quarters to the room nearest the back gate. He slept in his priest robes with his boots on. On the third day, he found Sylvia sitting in Edward's corridor again. He knelt beside her, said he was sorry, and she looked at him with those gray-blue eyes and said very quietly that she wanted Edward to come home. The high priest's words circled in his head like a prayer he could not finish. Stop reading the ledger. Start reading the pattern. He could not reconcile the two. So he kept walking, kept healing Gina, kept the fortress running, and did not sleep. Miles from the fortress, Edward sat with his back against a tree and pressed his palms over his ears. It did not help. The sound was not coming from outside. The domination bond carried Sylvia's grief the way a wire carries current, steadily, without interruption, without mercy. He could feel her, not her thoughts, not her words, just the shape of her distress, a low, constant ache behind his ribs that pulsed when she was awake and dulled only slightly when she slept. She had been crying again. He knew this the way he knew the wind had shifted, through a channel that had nothing to do with his senses and everything to do with the contract she had placed on him the day they met. He had planned for this. He had packed before Cole's accusation, known that leaving would split the assassin's attention, spread the right rumors through the right channels. The second wave would come expecting a weakened fortress and find the traps Sylvia had installed. All of it was correct. All of it was working. And none of it stopped a 7-year-old girl calling for him through a bond he could not silence. He had not slept in 3 nights. Cole woke to a sound he had been dreading. Whispers beyond the back gate, footsteps on stone, the faint scrape of metal on leather that meant weapons being drawn. He changed into his priest robes, already wearing them, and walked to the back gate. The corridor looked different. He had noticed this days ago, the subtle changes Sylvia's renovation magic had made to the walls and floor. Channels in the stone he did not remember, grooves that might have been decorative, slots near the ceiling that served no obvious purpose. He understood now. The back gate opened. They came through in a group, more than the first wave, better equipped, moving with the practiced silence of professionals. Their leader, a wiry man with a bandaged arm, directed them forward with hand signals. They fanned out into the corridor. Cole stepped into the torchlight. He held no weapon. He wore only his priest robes and the small religious pendant at his throat. He told them, calmly, that taking this fortress would start a war with the duchy, and that every one of them would be destroyed before the week ended. The leader smiled. Then the gates closed behind them. The bridge mechanism groaned and rotated, throwing two men off the edge and into the ravine below. The walls woke up. Spears fired from the slots Sylvia had carved into the stone. 4 sides, automatic, triggered by weight on the pressure plates she had embedded in the floor during Phase 3's renovation. The corridor became a killing channel. Men screamed, men fell. The leader dodged the first volley, took a spear through the forearm, and charged at Cole with his remaining hand on his blade. Edward came through the main gate. He had been monitoring the second wave for 2 days, tracking their route, watching them disguise as traveling performers, confirming their number. When they entered the back gate, he entered through the front. He found the leader in the corridor, bleeding from the arm, still swinging at Cole. Edward stepped between them and ended it. The man dropped. The traps had done what they were designed to do. Most of the second wave was dead or incapacitated. Edward interrogated the survivors, kept the ones willing to testify, chained the rest, and set the fortress livestock to guard them. Then he turned to Cole. His white hair was wild, stuck to his forehead with sweat. His coat was torn at the shoulder, no spectacles. His posture was different. No deliberate slouch, no pretense of civilian carelessness. He stood the way a knight stands. He had stopped hiding it. "Go to the main hall," he said. His voice was flat and tired. "Tell her everything, all of it, or leave this fortress tonight and do not come back." Sylvia was already awake. She had felt it, the bond shifting, the ache behind her ribs changing from absence to proximity. Edward was close. Edward was here. She came down the stairs in her nightclothes, barefoot, silver blonde hair tangled from sleep, and stopped at the entrance to the main hall. Edward stood on one side. Cole stood on the other. Neither was looking at each other. Cole spoke first. He told Sylvia about the skill he had kept hidden since he arrived. Absolution. The ability to see the weight of sins on a person's soul, a priest's gift that had shaped every decision he had made since walking through the fortress gate. He told her what he saw when he looked at Edward, a ledger soaked in red, heavy with fraud and theft, the accumulated weight of years of criminal enterprise. He told her this was why he had watched Edward, why he had patrolled at night, why he had confronted him, why he had been so certain that the man guarding Sylvia was also the man most likely to destroy her. Sylvia listened. She did not interrupt. Her eyes moved between the two men the way a person watches a scale trying to find its balance. Edward spoke next. He did not deny the ledger. The sins were real. He had been a swindler before he was a knight, and a knight before he was disowned, and a wanderer after that. He had taken money from people, forged documents, run schemes that left families poorer. He did not dress it up. He said what he had done, and he let it sit in the room. Then he explained the plan. He had known the assassins were coming from the moment Cole arrived. Cole's hidden identity had attracted the judicial chief's attention. Edward's response was not to prevent the attack, but to control it. Traps installed during renovation, choke points designed, himself positioned to handle anyone who got through. Both waves walked into the same prepared corridors. Both waves were destroyed, but there was a cost. Edward's voice did not change when he said it, but something behind his eyes did. Cole's midnight patrol had disrupted the timing. Sylvia's enchantments registered Cole's panicked energy as a threat signal and partially deactivated in the section where the first wave entered. A gap opened. Gina walked into that gap because she heard the fighting and came to protect Cole. Cole's interference caused Gina's injury. The room was silent for a long time. Cole did not argue. He did not defend himself. Everything he might have said, that his patrol was genuine concern, that no one had told him about the traps, was true, and none of it changed the outcome. Gina was lying in bed because Cole had been in the wrong place at the wrong time for the right reasons. His good intentions had produced the worst results anyone in the room could name. He was silent for a long time. Then he bowed. Not the practiced bow of a priest at the altar, but the deep, slow, unrehearsed bow of a man who understood exactly what he had done and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I am sorry," he said, not to the room, to Sylvia, to Edward, to Gina, who was not there to hear it. "I caused this. I did not intend it, but I caused it. And I am sorry." Edward did not respond immediately. His jaw worked. His hands, scraped at the knuckles from the night's fighting, opened and closed at his sides. He was not a forgiving person. He had said so himself, in different words, in a different phase of this story. The man who had watched Gina bleed in a corridor was not inclined toward grace, but Sylvia was watching him. And the 7-year-old girl who could not name her own grief had asked him a question with her eyes that he could not refuse. "Fine," Edward said. The word came out rough, bitten off, reluctant. He looked at Cole. He did not smile. He did not extend a hand. He just said it, and it was enough, and it was true, and it cost him something visible to say. Sylvia nodded once. She had listened to both men. She had asked her questions, quiet, direct, specific. She had updated her understanding of what had happened, and she had decided what she knew, and she had acted on it. She was 7 years old, and she was already the person the rest of them would spend their lives trying to keep up with. Sylvia found him in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights finally settling into his body now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. His torn coat hung open. His white hair was still matted to his forehead. He looked older than he was, and more tired than he would ever admit. Sylvia walked up to him and grabbed the front of his coat with both hands. She did not say anything at first. She just held on. Her fingers twisted into the fabric the way a child grips something when they are afraid it will be taken away. Not gently, not politely, with the kind of desperate, unconscious strength that comes from somewhere deeper than muscle. Edward opened his eyes. He looked down at her. Silver blonde hair tangled and unwashed. Bare feet on the cold stone. Gray-blue eyes that were not crying, not yet, but were doing something worse. They were looking at him with the total, unguarded need of a child who had just learned what it felt like to lose someone and had decided, with every cell in her small body, that she would not allow it to happen again. "You left," she said. Her voice was very small. Edward did not answer. He could not answer. 3 nights of Sylvia's grief coming through the domination bond had worn a groove in him that words could not fill. He had heard her. Every hour of every night, he had heard her. Not her voice, not her words, but the shape of her pain transmitted through a magical contract neither of them fully understood. He knelt. Not the way he had knelt when he first swore the contract. Practical, measured, the kneel of a man making a calculated arrangement. This was different. He went down on one knee in the corridor with his hand still caught in Sylvia's grip and his head bowed, and he did not say anything for a moment because the words had to come from somewhere real or they were not worth saying. Sylvia pressed her forehead against his shoulder and held on tighter. They stayed like that for a long time. Long enough for the candles to burn down a 1/4 inch. Long enough for Sylvia's breathing to slow from the ragged, hiccuping rhythm of held-back tears to something steadier. Long enough for Edward's hand to come up, slowly, and rest on the back of her head the way it had rested on the night he left. Except this time, he was not leaving. Gina watched from her doorway. She had woken to the sounds of the second wave's aftermath, the crash of the traps, the distant shouts, the rumble of the bridge mechanism. She had pulled herself upright despite the wound in her side and the burn on her shoulder, and walked to the door because she was Gina. And lying still while the fortress was under attack was not something her body knew how to do. She saw them in the corridor, Edward on one knee. Sylvia pressed against him like a barnacle on a ship's hull, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. Gina leaned against the doorframe and watched, and her eyes were bright, and she said nothing, and the expression on her face was the kind of fierce, quiet pride that does not need words, because words would only diminish it. Cole stood at the far end of the corridor. His hands were folded. His beautiful face was unreadable. He did not interrupt. In the days that followed, the fortress exhaled. Gina's wound continued to close under Cole's daily healing. She was walking by the 3rd day, back in the kitchen by the 5th, reorganizing the pantry with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent too long in bed. Cole's relatives arrived on the 7th day, Marquis Aldrich and Lord Ellis, names Edward had summoned through a letter sent before his departure, routed through Cole's noble connections to create a situation where resolving Cole's status was more advantageous than leaving it ambiguous. The meeting was formal and brief. Marquis Aldrich recognized his son. Lord Ellis handled the legal paperwork. Cole's past was acknowledged and severed. The man who had framed him had already been executed. The surviving assassins were handed to Marquis Aldrich's guard. Cole stood before his father in priest robes with his hands folded and told them the truth. His life was here. He left with the escort to settle the remaining threads. He bowed to Sylvia before he went. The deep bow, the real one, learned not from the church but from the corridor where he apologized. Cole returned 3 weeks later. He came through the front gate with a single bag and no escort. He walked into the courtyard, saw Edward sharpening a blade on the bench, saw Gina hanging laundry in the side yard, saw Sylvia sitting on the low wall with her legs dangling and a chicken under one arm, and he stopped. "I am staying," he said. Not a question, not a request. Edward did not look up from the blade. "We know." Gina waved from the laundry line. "Your room is ready." Sylvia looked at him with those gray blue eyes and said nothing, but she shifted over on the wall just slightly, the way a person makes room for someone who belongs beside them. Cole walked to the wall, set down his bag, and sat next to her. The fortress was whole. The team was complete. The assassin threat was gone. The political thread severed. The city growing beyond the walls. For the first time since Sylvia had stood before the raised drawbridge and reached for her magic, it was genuinely safe. Edward found her in the evening. She was sitting on the floor outside her room with a book Gina had given her open on her lap. Though she was not reading it, she was looking at the wall across the corridor, at nothing in particular, with the expression she wore when her mind was working on something she did not have words for yet. He sat down beside her. The corridor was quiet. Through the far window, the last light of the day was turning the sky the color of old copper. "I am not leaving again," he said. Sylvia looked at him. "I know there were reasons. I know the plan worked. I know the fortress is safe because I left and came back at the right time." He paused. "None of that matters. I am not leaving again." She did not say anything. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the first day when she offered him the contract. Small fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles with a grip that was far too strong for a child her size. Edward knelt, the same knee, the same girl. But the words were different this time. The first oath had been practical, a contract dressed in loyalty's clothing, careful qualifications from a man who did not trust promises because every promise he had ever been given had been broken. This time, he said one word: forever. No qualification, no condition, no careful distance, just the word and the silence after it, and Sylvia's hand in his, and the weight of it settling into the corridor like something that had always been there and was only now being named. Sylvia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who has decided something and will not be moved, "Edward is a genius." He almost laughed. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved, and his eyes were bright, and the sound that came out of him was closer to a breath than a word. "Yes, my lady," he said. "I suppose I am." The fortress was quiet. The city hummed beyond the walls. Somewhere in the courtyard, a chicken made a sound that might have been agreement. They sat together in the corridor and watched the last of the light fade, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to, because the fortress was whole, and the people in it had chosen each other, and that was enough. It was enough. Months passed, and the fortress learned how to breathe. The mornings had a shape now. Gina opened the curtains at the same hour every day, and Sylvia woke to sunlight on the stone floor and the distant sound of chickens arguing over something that was probably not worth arguing over. There was breakfast in the hall, bread baked before dawn, butter from the cow, eggs from the hens who had followed Sylvia down the road on the first day and never once considered leaving. The food was simple. It was also, by any honest measure, better than anything the Hughes estate had ever served a child who ate alone. Sylvia's hair was still impossible. Gina wrestled with it every morning, fine, silver blonde, and slippery as water over glass. The twin tails held. Nothing else did. After breakfast, Sylvia went to the stables. She did this every morning without fail, the way a general inspects a garrison. The pig saw her coming and trotted forward. The cow turned its head with the slow, regal acknowledgement of something that believed itself to be in charge. The chickens scattered, then regrouped, then scattered again. Their formation was a work in progress. Sylvia crouched beside the pig and scratched behind its ear. The pig made a sound that was, by any reasonable interpretation, contentment. This was the Lord of Forte. She was 7 years old, she had magic that could reshape stone, and the happiest part of her morning was a pig who liked having its ears scratched. The city had a name now, and the name was not Sylvia's. The mayor had suggested it twice, both times with the careful deference of a man who believed he was paying a compliment. Both times, Sylvia had looked at him with the flat, unblinking expression of a child who had just been offered something she found personally offensive. "I hate it," she had said. No explanation, no softening. The mayor had opened his mouth to try a third time, and Edward, standing behind Sylvia with his arms crossed, had shaken his head once. The mayor understood. They named it Forte. It was the old name, the name the peninsula had carried before the bridge was destroyed and the city was forgotten. Sylvia approved this immediately. A name that belonged to the place, not to a person. A name that meant strong. She signed the document with the contract spell glowing faintly around her fingertips, and the magic settled into the paper like ink into cloth. The signing happened at the mayor's house because Sylvia refused to use her own office. Edward had asked her to design one when the fortress was first claimed. She had reached for the only reference she knew, the study in the Hughes mansion, the room where her father received visitors and her mother issued orders, and neither of them had ever once asked Sylvia to sit down. She had rebuilt it faithfully. Dark wood, heavy drapes, a desk too large for a child, a crest she did not love mounted on the wall. The room was perfect and cold, and it made her stomach hurt in ways she could not explain. So she went to the mayor's cramped, sunlit office instead, where the desk was cluttered with papers and the chair had a cushion that someone's wife had sewn. She rode there on the pig. The citizens of Fort had stopped questioning this. They lined the street, not in formal rows, but the way people naturally gather when something worth seeing passes by. A 7-year-old girl on a pig, sitting upright with perfect posture that Edward had drilled into her, followed by a cow-drawn cart carrying Gina and a stack of documents. Edward walked beside them, tall and white-haired, and visibly refusing to acknowledge that this was his life now. The pig did not startle. It did not veer. It moved with the composed dignity of an animal that understood it was carrying someone important. Sylvia signed 3 contracts that afternoon, trade agreements with merchants who had crossed the new bridge, tax arrangements for the inn operators, a land use agreement for the fields south of the fortress. Each contract sealed with magic that no court in the kingdom could break. The mayor watched her press her small hand against each document and said very quietly to Gina that he had served 4 lords in his career, and this one frightened him the least and impressed him the most. The city was growing, and growth brought strangers. They came from across the bridge, merchants, laborers, families looking for land that was not taxed into dust by a lord who had forgotten they existed. Some came from the neighboring country, drawn by rumors of a peninsula where the soil produced twice what it should, and the lord was a child who could reshape buildings with her hands. Some of them were exactly what they appeared to be. Some were not. Edward built the screening system the way he built everything, with the methodical precision of a man who had once trusted the wrong person and intended never to do so again. Every new resident passed through 3 gates. First, the mayor assessed their trade skills and housing needs. Second, Sylvia used her domination magic to register their acknowledgement, a process that felt, to the applicant, like a moment of lightheadedness and a sudden, inexplicable urge to be honest. Third, they sat across from Cole. Cole's part was the one no applicant expected. He sat at a wooden table with his hands folded and his beautiful face arranged in professional neutrality. He asked their name, their trade, where they had come from. While they answered, he read them. The absolution skill did not hear lies. It did not detect intention. What it saw was weight, the accumulated mass of acts a person considered sinful, carried visibly in Cole's perception like soot on a wall. A farmer who had stolen grain during a famine carried a thin gray film. A merchant who had cheated customers carried a heavier mark, darker, layered. A person who had done something truly terrible carried red. Most applicants passed. Their marks were small, human, the ordinary weight of ordinary lives. Cole noted them, nodded, and they were admitted. Some did not pass. A man with deep red marks who claimed to be a traveling carpenter. A woman whose sin weight pulsed around her hands in a way Cole had learned to associate with violence, done deliberately and recently. They were turned away at the gate, given supplies for the road, and told that Fort was not accepting residents at this time. Edward delivered the final word, standing behind the rejected applicant with the posture of a man who was not making a suggestion. With Within weeks, Fort's reputation shifted. Travelers noticed that the streets were cleaner than most cities, the merchants more honest, the disputes fewer. They did not know why. They simply felt it. A city where something was different. The city kept its secrets the way its lord kept hers, quietly, without ceremony, and with absolute effectiveness. Gina was changing. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet accumulation of small adjustments. The way a house being renovated looks the same from the street, until one day the windows are different and the door has been replaced, and the whole structure is suddenly, unmistakably better. She poured tea now without spilling. This had not always been the case. The first cup she had made Edward, weeks after arriving at the fortress, had been so bitter he had considered the possibility that she was trying to poison him. There had been a cooking incident involving Sylvia, a competitive streak neither of them would acknowledge, and Edward's scolding afterward, real scolding, born of genuine frustration rather than cruelty. Gina had listened. She had trained. She had gotten better, the way she got better at everything, through sheer repetition, until the thing she could not do became the thing she could. Now she served tea that Edward drank without comment, which was his highest form of compliment. She was learning other things too. The proper way to announce a visitor, the correct form of address for a marquis versus a baron versus a count. Cole taught her the foreign variations. Edward taught her the domestic ones. Neither had been asked. They simply noticed that Gina was preparing for something, and they helped because helping Gina was one of the things they did now. She was becoming a lady's maid, not the kind who fetches dresses and pins hair. She already did that. She was becoming the kind who stands behind a lord in a room full of nobles and knows, without being told, which fork is wrong, which bow is shallow, which smile is hiding something. One evening at dinner, Sylvia said, without looking up from her plate, that Gina's tea was much better now. Gina's face did something complicated. Then she smiled. Edward, across the table, pretended he had not seen it. The conversation happened after Sylvia was asleep. Gina was sitting at the small desk in her room, mending one of Sylvia's dresses, the stitches tight and even, the work of hands that had been sewing since they were large enough to hold a needle. Edward leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He had come to discuss the new trade routes. He had not started. "You mentioned an uncle once," he said. Gina's needle paused, just for a moment. Then it continued, pulling thread through fabric in the same steady rhythm. Cosmo. She did not look up. He was a traveling merchant, my mother's brother. When I was small, he took me on a trip once, just one, but I remember everything about it. The road, the towns, the way he let me choose which market stall to visit first. She tied off the stitch and cut the thread. After my parents died, the workshop family told him I was happy, that I did not need visitors, that coming around would confuse me. Her voice was level, the way it always was when she spoke about things that had been done to her, factual, precise, as if she were describing weather. He came anyway for a while. Then he stopped. I do not know if they threatened him or if he believed them. I was never asked. Edward filed the name. He filed the detail about the workshop family blocking visits. He filed the fact that Gina's hands had not trembled, which told him more about what this cost her than trembling would have. I can find him, he said. It will take time. Wandering merchants are difficult to track, but my network handles difficult. Gina looked up. Her expression was careful, the expression of someone who had learned not to want things too visibly, because wanting made you vulnerable, and vulnerability was what the workshop family had used against her for years. How much will it cost? Edward named a figure. It was reasonable. Gina nodded and said she would have it deducted from her wages. Neither of them mentioned that the figure Edward named was roughly a third of what the investigation would actually cost. Neither of them needed to. Somewhere far from Fort, a workshop was falling apart. The master had noticed it gradually, the way a man notices a wall cracking only after the crack has reached the ceiling. Orders were late. Seams were uneven. The apprentices he had always considered adequate turned out to be adequate only because someone else had been checking their work, quietly, without recognition, for years. Gina had been the backbone of the business. He had known this in the way that people know things they refuse to say aloud, the way a man knows his house is standing because of one beam he never bothered to inspect. Now the beam was gone, and the house was listing. He had made inquiries through merchants who owed him favors. He was looking for a girl, young, brown-haired, a seamstress. He had not found her. He did not know she was behind the walls of a fortress on a peninsula his contacts had never heard of, serving a lord who had given her something the workshop never had, a choice. He would keep looking. What he called concern, anyone watching from outside would have called inventory recovery. The letter was Cole's idea. Gina needed training that none of them could fully provide. Edward could teach her domestic protocol. Cole could teach the foreign variations. But the invisible architecture of noble households, the way a marquis's staff moved and spoke, and anticipated needs that had not yet been expressed, that required someone who had lived inside it. Cole drafted the request carefully. The letter was addressed to Lord Ellis, his adoptive father, with a note asking him to forward the request to Marquis Aldrich. Edward read it standing by the window. "You are asking your father's patron to send us a teacher," he said. "I am asking for a recommendation." Cole's pen did not stop. "The distinction matters." Edward made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The distinction matters to you. Marquis Aldrich will read it as an opportunity to place someone inside the fortress. He is a politician. That is what politicians do. He will not send a spy." Cole set down the pen. "He knows I would see it. He will send someone who serves two purposes." Edward turned from the window. "A genuine teacher who also happens to report back. Not a spy, an observer. The distinction matters." He paused. "I said that with irony, I noticed." The letter went out the next morning. Lord Ellis forwarded it within the week. Marquis Aldrich received it, read it twice, and understood exactly what Edward had predicted he would understand: an opportunity. The reply arrived faster than any of them expected. Edward read the letter aloud. His voice was flat, the way it always was when he was processing something he did not enjoy. Marquis Aldrich was sending a teacher, not a retired governess, not a minor noble's widow with time to spare. He was sending the daughter of a neighboring marquis, a woman named Bridget, whose engagement to the second prince had recently been broken over a bullying rumor that may or may not have been true. She would arrive with her own maid. She would stay for an unspecified duration. The tone of the letter suggested that Marquis Aldrich considered this a favor he was doing for everyone involved. The room was quiet for a moment. "A marquis's daughter," Gina said. "From a neighboring country," Cole added. Edward folded the letter with deliberate care. He saw an opening. "The woman needs somewhere to go that is not the court where her reputation was damaged. We need a tutor. He placed her here because it serves both problems and gives him a friendly presence inside the fortress." He paused. "This is, by noble standards, a perfectly elegant solution. I find it exhausting." Sylvia, who had been sitting on a chair with her legs swinging because her feet did not reach the floor, looked up. "Is she nice?" The three adults exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. "We do not know yet," Cole said, "but we will find out before she arrives." Edward was already writing a list. Restricted areas of the fortress, the stables, the unfinished floors, the rooms Sylvia had not yet renovated, access protocols for the new arrival, a secondary maid assignment to accompany Bridget at all times. The livestock were absolutely, under no circumstances, to be introduced to a visiting noble without supervision. Edward had seen what the chickens could do to an intruder. He did not want to explain that to a marquis's diplomatic correspondence. The preparations began that afternoon. The fortress had survived assassins, grief, and a bridge that needed rebuilding. It would now attempt something arguably more dangerous: hospitality. That evening, Sylvia sat on the fortress wall with her feet dangling over the edge. Edward stood beside her, not sitting. He never sat when she was near a drop, even though the wall was wide and she had climbed it 100 times. His hands were at his sides, but his weight was shifted forward, ready. Below them, forts spread out in the last light. The bridge, her bridge, the one she had rebuilt with magic that left her sleeping for 2 days, carried the last merchants of the evening back toward the neighboring country. Lanterns were being lit in the inn windows. Somewhere near the market, a woman was calling her children inside for dinner. "The city is bigger," she said. "It is," he said. Sylvia pulled her knees up and rested her chin on them. The wind moved her silver blonde hair across her face, and she did not push it away. "Edward." "Yes, the lady who is coming. Bridget." She said the name carefully, the way she said all new names, tasting it, deciding if it fit. "If she is not nice, she goes home." Edward looked at the 7-year-old girl who had rebuilt a bridge, named a city, ridden a pig to official functions, and just issued a diplomatic ultimatum with the same tone she used to ask for breakfast. "Understood," he said. The sun dropped below the rooftops. The lanterns multiplied. Fort settled into the evening, the way a living thing settles into sleep, slowly, with a few last sounds, and then quiet. Somewhere far away, a workshop master was still looking for a girl he had lost. Somewhere closer, a letter was making its way to a marquise's daughter who did not yet know that her life was about to change. And here, on the wall, a child who did not know she was building a kingdom sat with her knight and watched the city she had made exist glow in the dark. She did not know yet that the people she was gathering would be the ones who chose to stay. She would learn. The candidates arrived at 9 in the morning, 6 of them, lined up inside the great hall like men awaiting sentencing. They had been recommended by Marquis Aldrich, and they carried themselves accordingly, composed, professional, hands folded, eyes forward. They did not know what they were walking into. Cole spoke first. He stood at the front of the hall in his pale priest robes and delivered a speech about Sylvia's expectations that was, by any reasonable standard, unhinged. He told them that service in this fortress began with confession, that their sins would be weighed, that their devotion to Sylvia should be second only to their devotion to God, and that in practical terms, the order of priority was negotiable. The candidates exchanged looks. 2 of them swallowed visibly. Edward stepped forward next, hands behind his back, posture fully upright. He did not soften what Cole had said. He simply added that anyone rejected by Sylvia should not take it personally. She will know, he said, without elaborating on what she would know or how. He let the silence do the rest. Then the door behind them opened, and Sylvia walked in. She had dressed for the occasion. Gina had done her hair. She carried a short wooden staff and wore the traveling cloak she had owned since exile because she had no formal robes and refused to pretend otherwise. She climbed into the oversized chair behind the desk. Her feet did not reach the floor and looked out at 6 grown men with the calm, evaluating gaze of someone who had been reading people since before she could read books. Gina, standing to the side, pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Do you want to serve me?" Sylvia asked. Her voice was flat, rehearsed, and utterly serious. She released the domination spell. It moved through the room like a wave of pressure, not violent, not painful, but undeniable. One by one, the candidates dropped to their knees. Their bodies recognized what their minds had not yet processed. 5 of them knelt fully, heads bowed, submission genuine and complete. The 6th knelt a half-second late. His head dipped, but his shoulders stayed rigid. Sylvia pointed at him. "You do not want to serve me." The man's face went white. He started to protest. Something about nerves, about the unfamiliar magic, about how he was simply startled. Edward watched him without expression. Cole's eyes had already moved past him. "You may leave," Sylvia said. He left. No one escorted him. No one needed to. The 5 who remained did not look up until Sylvia told them to. Edward waited until the accepted candidates had been led to their quarters before he turned to Cole in the corridor. 1 out of 6. He kept his voice low. "Aldrich's screening is either worse than I thought, or that was deliberate." Cole tilted his head slightly. "The 5 are clean, ordinary weight, nothing that concerns me. The 6th carried something heavier, not violent, divided. Divided how?" His acknowledgement of Sylvia was incomplete. He knelt because the others did. His intention was split between serving her and reporting to someone else. Edward exhaled through his nose. Aldrich sent a spy and 5 good candidates, hoped the spy would pass under normal screening. He did not account for domination magic. Cole's mouth curved, not quite a smile. People rarely do. The rejected candidate came back. He appeared at the hall door within the hour, escorted by no one, face stripped of the composure he had worn during the interview. He asked to speak to Sylvia. Edward moved to block him, but Cole raised a hand. "Let him talk." The man stepped into the hall and dropped to his knees. Not the controlled kneel of the interview, but a collapse. His forehead touched the stone floor. His name was Brett, he said. He had been sent by Marquis Aldrich's household as an operative. His family had served the Aldrich estate for generations. The eldest son inherited the position and the favor. The rest were used, deployed, discarded, replaced. He had been trained for infiltration since he could walk. He had never chosen a master. He had only ever been assigned one. He confessed everything. The mission parameters, the reporting structure, the information he was meant to gather. He held nothing back. His voice stayed level throughout, the precision of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was a liability. Then he said something that stopped the room. "I am asking for a permanent magical contract, eternal loyalty, not employment, a binding. I want to serve this lord and no one else, for as long as I am alive." Edward stared at him. Gina, who had come in partway through, stood very still by the door. Cole studied Brett for a long time. The silence in the hall was the kind that presses against the ears. "His repentance is genuine," Cole said quietly. "I have seen forced contrition. This is not that. The weight he carried when he walked in has changed. He is not performing." Sylvia looked at Brett on the floor. She looked at Cole. She looked at Edward. "If Cole says it is real," she said, "then I will give him the contract." She extended her hand. The magic flowed. Contract, the same spell she had used on her mother, on Edward, on Gina. The binding settled over Brett like a second skin. He did not flinch. He did not breathe for a moment. Then he exhaled, and something in his posture shifted. The operative was gone. What remained was a man who had, for the first time in his life, chosen where he stood. Edward pulled Gina aside afterward. She was watching Brett receive his uniform from one of the new servants. His movements already precise, already efficient, already cataloging the room. "I am waiting," Edward said, "for this to be a mistake." Gina studied Brett's back. "He reminds me of you, the first week." Edward opened his mouth, closed it, and walked away without responding. Brett's first day as a contracted servant lasted approximately 4 hours before he proposed something that made the room go silent. It happened during the afternoon briefing. Edward had gathered the inner circle, Cole, Gina, Brett, and Sylvia, to discuss the logistics of Bridget's upcoming arrival. The tutor was a marquise's daughter from the neighboring country, and hosting her carried political weight that none of them could afford to mishandle. "She will have restricted movement," Edward said, spreading a rough floor plan across the table. "The stables are off limits. The back gate is off limits. The Lord's private floor is off limits unless Sylvia invites her personally." Cole nodded. "The back gate is a liability regardless. If she reached it and crossed into Hughes' territory, the diplomatic consequences would outlast all of us. Brett will serve as her dedicated liaison." Edward glanced at Brett, who stood at the edge of the table with his hands clasped behind his back. "You will manage her schedule, her access, her requests. You were trained in the Aldrich household. Noble protocol is not new to you." "Understood," Brett said. His tone was clipped, professional, exactly what the assignment required. Edward continued. "Gina, you will be Sylvia's primary attendant during the visit. The new senior maids, Daphne and Romina, will handle secondary duties. We cannot afford the tutor seeing an informal household and reporting back that this fortress is playing at governance." Gina straightened. "I will be ready." "Good. Now, the stables." Edward paused. "This is not a formality. Sylvia's animals are under domination magic. They are intelligent, territorial, and capable of serious harm. The horse killed 2 intruders during the Phase 4 attack without being commanded to. The chickens participated. If the tutor wanders into the stables and does something the animals interpret as a threat to Sylvia," he trailed off meaningfully. Brett raised his hand. "A point of clarification. Go ahead. If the tutor insults you, sir, or disrespects Lady Sylvia in any capacity, shall I dispose of her immediately, or would you prefer I wait for a second offense?" The room went quiet. Gina's hand stopped halfway to her teacup. Cole blinked once, slowly. Edward's jaw tightened. Sylvia looked up from the floor plan she had been studying with genuine curiosity, as though the question were perfectly reasonable, and she simply wanted to hear the answer. "No," Edward said. "A warning first, then?" "No, Brett. No disposing of anyone at any point." Brett inclined his head. "Understood. I will defer to your judgment on the matter." His tone suggested that deferring was a professional courtesy he could withdraw at any time. Edward looked at Gina. She looked back at him with an expression that said very clearly, "You brought this on yourself." The briefing continued. Brett did not raise the topic again. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood that if Bridget proved hostile, the most dangerous person on the staff would be the one standing politely beside her, holding her schedule. The exploration happened 2 days later. Sylvia had been sensing the sealed rooms for weeks. Her ownership magic mapped the fortress the way a heartbeat maps a body, and she had grown restless about the parts she could feel but not see. She led the group herself, riding the pig through corridors that the staff had not yet entered. The first sealed door opened onto a training ground. It was larger than any of them expected, a full square of packed earth open to the sky, ringed by low stone buildings that had once been equipment sheds and a stable annex. Weeds had conquered every surface. The stone was cracked. The stable roof had partially collapsed. Sylvia dismounted, walked to the center of the square, and cast renovation. The magic rolled outward from her in a visible wave. Weeds pulled back into the earth. Cracks sealed. The collapsed roof reassembled itself, stone and timber finding their places like a puzzle reversing. The packed earth flattened and hardened. Within a minute, the training ground looked as though soldiers had used it that morning. Brett, who had not yet seen renovation magic at full scale, stood very still. His eyes moved across the restored square with the careful assessment of an operative cataloging an asset. "This is where a garrison would have trained," Edward said, running his hand along the restored stable wall. "The fortress was built for a standing force. Whoever owned it before the Hughes family intended to keep soldiers here. We will need that," Cole said quietly. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The weapons cache was behind the third sealed door. Most of the fortress's storage rooms had been emptied or smashed long ago. Broken racks, scattered rust, the remains of equipment that no one had maintained in decades. But one room had been sealed properly, its door locked with a mechanism that Sylvia's ownership magic opened without effort. Inside, the torchlight caught metal. Racks of weapons lined both walls: swords, spears, daggers, polearms, and they were not rusted. Edward picked up a blade and turned it in the light. His expression changed. "Mithril," he said. He set it down and picked up another. "Magic steel." He looked at the room with new eyes. "These are not garrison weapons. This is a treasury." Brett stepped forward and examined the racks methodically. The Hughes family hid these. Mithril and magic steel in a fortress they publicly called worthless would raise questions they could not answer. Why was a forgotten ruin equipped for a war? So they sealed the room and pretended it did not exist, Edward said. Easier than explaining. Sylvia touched one of the daggers. It was nearly as long as her forearm. She did not pick it up. "They are yours now," Edward told her. "All of it." He turned to Gina. "You should upgrade. That dagger you have been carrying since the corridor fight is functional, but these are better by an order of magnitude." Gina shook her head. "My dagger works fine, and I do not want to carry something that makes people wonder where I got it." Edward looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "I will choose one for you anyway. You will carry it when I say so." Gina sighed, but she did not argue. She had learned by now which of Edward's suggestions were suggestions and which were decisions he had already made. The prison was behind the church. Cole led them down a narrow staircase to a corridor of stone cells. Small, functional, recently used. Edward's interrogation equipment was still set up in one of them. He did not explain this, and no one asked. Sylvia looked into the cells without expression. She had known the prison existed. Ownership magic told her everything inside the fortress walls, but she had never come down here. "You spend a lot of time here," she said to Edward. It was not a question. "When necessary." His voice was careful. "With criminals. With people who need to answer questions they do not want to answer." She looked at the cells for another moment, then turned and walked back toward the stairs. She did not comment further. She did not need to. Edward watched her go, and something crossed his face. Not guilt, not defensiveness. Something closer to the awareness that the child he protected was also the Lord he answered to, and those two things did not always ask for the same version of him. Cole caught Edward's eye as they followed Sylvia up the stairs. He said nothing. His expression said enough. The drawing room was the last stop. It was on the Lord's floor, the private level that Sylvia occupied, but rarely used in full. The room had been sealed behind a wall of later construction, something added by a previous owner to conceal whatever lay behind it. Sylvia's renovation magic did not discriminate between legitimate structure and deliberate concealment. When she cast the spell, the false wall dissolved. The room emerged as though it had been waiting. Dust cleared. Wallpaper appeared. Faded floral patterns that spoke of a different century. The wooden floor repaired itself plank by plank. A fireplace rebuilt its mantle from scattered stone. Curtains materialized along windows that had been bricked over. Furniture straightened. Upholstery restored. A writing desk reassembled its drawers. And above the fireplace, a painting. It had been hidden behind the false wall. Not damaged, not forgotten, but deliberately concealed. The renovation magic had brought it forward with everything else. It now hung in its original position above the mantle, and every person in the room looked at it. The painting showed a family, a man and a woman seated, 3 children standing beside them, all of them dressed in clothing that predated the Hughes family's ownership of the fortress by what looked like generations. The style of the clothes, the background, a garden that might have been the courtyard, the pose of casual, unperformed warmth, a family that had been happy here. Sylvia stared at it for a long time. "I do not know them," she said. "These are not my family." "The fortress had other owners before the Hughes," Edward said, moving closer to the painting. "The brushwork was fine, the preservation remarkable. Someone sealed this room specifically to hide it, or to protect it." Gina stood beside Sylvia. She said nothing. She did not need to. Every person in the room had left a family under conditions that made this painting, this image of people who chose to be together and were happy about it, land differently than it would have for anyone else. Cole studied the faces in the painting with the careful attention of a man whose skill showed him people's sins. These faces showed him nothing. They were paint. Brett stepped forward. "I can investigate. The mayor may have records. The church archives might hold land transfers that predate the Hughes contract." Edward nodded. "Low priority, but yes, find out who they were." Brett inclined his head and filed the task with the same precision he filed everything, immediately, completely, without visible effort. Sylvia turned away from the painting. She looked at the restored room, the warm wood, the clean windows, the fireplace that worked again. "We should hang a painting of us," she said. The room went still. Then Gina smiled. Cole's mouth softened. Brett looked like he might weep from professional devotion. Edward exhaled through his nose, the sound he made when something landed harder than he was prepared for. "Yes," he said, "we should." They left the drawing room with the unknown family still watching from above the mantel. The late afternoon light fell across the painting in gold, and the faces in it looked as though they had been waiting a very long time to be seen again. Brett asked for the meeting before anyone else was awake. Edward found him in the library beside the exposed hidden room, a yellow document already laid on the reading table. Brett had been through every record in the chamber: ledgers, household rolls, correspondence bound in cracked leather. He had found what he was looking for. "The fortress's night register," Brett said. 3 generations before the Hughes family took ownership. He turned the page so Edward could see. The ink had faded to brown, but near the bottom of a column listing night officers by family name, Narcizo. Their ancestors served this fortress, not as hired soldiers, as the Night Order. Edward studied Brett's face. "You knew this already." "I suspected." The hidden room confirmed it. Something in Brett's voice shifted, a thread of warmth buried under the precision. "The man who leads the Narciso now is the same man who rescued me from my father when I was a child. His name is Norman. You want to bring him here. I want to bring all of them. The clan has been scattered since they were expelled from their last employer, over a decade ago. Mercenary contracts, information brokering, nowhere permanent." Brett paused. "Norman saved my life. This is the opportunity to repay that." Edward folded his arms. "Mercenaries with a gray past and family ties to the operative who just converted from being my lord's spy. Which is why I am not asking you to trust them. I am asking you to let Sylvia evaluate them. If her domination magic confirms their intent, they are worth more than any garrison we could hire." Edward looked at the register one more time. The Narciso name, 3 generations deep, written in ink older than anyone alive. "Arrange the contact," he said. "I want them here within the week." Brett inclined his head. Something behind his eyes settled. A debt that had waited years finding its first path toward repayment. They arrived 6 days later. Norman came with 11 of his clan, all men, all carrying the same hard-boned family resemblance that made them identifiable as a unit from across the courtyard. They walked in a loose formation that suggested military discipline worn casually, the way a soldier carries a weapon he has held so long it no longer feels like carrying. Edward had arranged the meeting in the restored training ground, open air, clear sightlines. Cole stood to his left. Brett waited near the entrance, positioned where Norman would see him first. Norman saw him first. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, with a face shaped more by combat than by time. Dark hair cropped short, practical armor over traveling clothes that had seen real distance. His hands hung at his sides the way Edward's did, ready without performing readiness. He crossed the distance to Brett and stopped. He did not embrace him. He looked at Brett the way a man looks at a building he constructed years ago and finds still standing. "You look well," Norman said. "I serve someone worth serving now." Brett's voice carried more weight than those words should have held. Norman nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a chapter. He turned to Edward. "I am Norman. I lead the Narciso clan. I would like to present our petition to the Lord directly." Cole leaned toward Edward and whispered something. Edward gave a slight nod. Sylvia walked out. Gina had dressed her for the occasion. Fitted vest over a ruffled shirt, trousers tucked into polished boots. the traveling cloak that was the closest thing she owned to ceremonial attire. She carried her short staff. Her silver blonde hair fell loose. She looked 7 years old and like the lord of a fortress, and somehow both were true at the same time. Brett introduced her with a formality that bordered on theatrical. Edward sighed. Norman knelt. His clan knelt behind him, synchronized, instinctive. "My clan is the Narcizo," he said. "Our ancestors served this fortress before any duke claimed it. We have lived scattered for over a decade. I am asking for a place where my people can settle and serve. I am asking for a lord worth the oath." "Where do you want to live?" Sylvia asked. "The southern coast, near the old village." She considered this for exactly as long as it took her to draw one breath. "Then you may live there, and you may serve here." Norman looked up. His clan looked up behind him. They had prepared for negotiations, conditions, tests. They had not prepared for a 7-year-old who decided things the way other people blinked. Sylvia stepped forward and released the domination spell. It moved through the training ground the way it always did. A wave of pressure that was not pain but was undeniable. Norman felt it land. His clan felt it behind him. The magic did not command obedience. It declared ownership. It said, "I know you are here and you are mine." Norman bowed his head. "We are yours." Sylvia looked at her people. Edward with his arms folded. Cole with his careful stillness. Gina with a smile she was not hiding. Brett with an expression that might have been the closest he had ever come to looking happy. "Edward will handle the details." Edward stepped forward and laid out the terms. Southern coastland for settlement. Patrol duties immediate. 3 members rotating as Sylvia's personal guard. Compensation in land and provisions. Families welcome, but every new arrival had to present themselves to Sylvia for domination acknowledgement before settling. No exceptions. Norman accepted every term without negotiation. He was not a man who haggled when the offer was already more than he had dared to hope for. They rode south the next morning. The coastal village sat an hour's ride through thinning forest, past the point where the trees gave way to salt grass and the sound of the sea. Sylvia rode behind Edward and Norman on her pig, 3 of Norman's men trailing as her newly assigned guard. The village appeared through the last stretch of coastal scrub like a wound. Stone walls stood at angles that defied their own weight. Roofs had collapsed inward. A fishing dock jutted into the shallows, its planks rotted through. Whatever the Narciso had built here, houses, workshops, a communal hall, had been left to decay until decay was all that remained. Norman dismounted and stood at the edge. He said nothing, but his stillness had a quality different from his usual composure, something that had been carried for a long time and was now being set down in the place it belonged. His men spread through the ruins. They touched door frames. They recognized the layout of a home they had never lived in, but had heard described their entire lives. Edward walked up beside Norman. "We can begin reconstruction in stages. Prioritize shelter, then the dock." "I can fix it," Sylvia said. She had dismounted and was standing at the entrance, staff planted in the sandy soil, looking at the ruins the way she looked at every broken thing she had ever claimed, with assessment and something deeper. Edward turned. "The whole village? It is inside the territory I claimed. This is dozens of structures. The scale is different from a room or a training ground. I know what it is." The wind off the sea caught her hair. They came here because Brett asked them to. Brett asked because Norman saved him. Norman saved him because that is what Norman does. And now their home is broken and I can fix it. The logic was clean. The decision was already made. Edward recognized the expression and stopped arguing. He turned to Norman. "Watch." Sylvia walked to the center of the village, what had once been a small square where the communal hall met the main path. She planted her feet. She closed her eyes. She reached for the magic the way she always did, the way a person reaches for a door handle. Except this time, the door was the size of a town. The renovation spell unfolded. It started at her feet, packed earth smoothing, weeds withdrawing, cobblestones rising from beneath years of silt and reassembling themselves into a path. Then it spread outward. The nearest wall straightened with a grinding sound that felt less like construction and more like the earth remembering where things were supposed to be. Then the roofs. Collapsed structures rebuilt themselves from rubble. Timber beams rose from rotted wood and became solid. Thatch wove itself back into place. The communal hall restored from the inside out, furniture assembling from splinters, a hearth rebuilding its chimney stone by stone. The dock rebuilt itself. Posts drove back into the sand. Planks stretched across gaps and fused. The listing supports straightened with sounds like a ship settling into water. Sylvia did not open her eyes. Sweat ran down her temples. Her breathing was visible, each exhale harder than the last. The magic was pulling from her in quantities she had never channeled before. She did not stop. The houses at the far edge, the most damaged, restored last. Walls rose from foundations buried under forest encroachment. Roots withdrew. Stone climbed. By the time the last roof sealed itself shut, the village looked as though no time had passed at all, as though the Narcizo had simply stepped out for the afternoon and the village had been waiting, patient and whole, for them to come home. Sylvia opened her eyes. She took one step forward. She took another. On the third step, her legs gave out. Edward caught her before she hit the ground. He lifted her, one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders, her head falling against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, and in this moment the lightness felt wrong, a reminder that the body doing all of this was still the body of a 7-year-old child. "Idiot," he said quietly. His voice was rough. She murmured something against his coat. It might have been, "It looks good." Her eyes were already closing. Norman stood in the center of his restored village. He looked at the houses. He looked at the dock. He looked at the path under his feet, clean cobblestones, laid in a pattern his grandfather had described to him and that he had never expected to see. He dropped to his knees. Behind him, every man in his clan dropped with him. Not the controlled kneel of the petition, something rawer, from a place below protocol. 11 men kneeling in a village they had been told about their entire lives, restored in an afternoon by a child who had done it because it needed doing. "We are hers," Norman said. "For as long as we breathe, no oath required, no contract needed. Tell her when she wakes." Edward looked down at Sylvia, unconscious against his chest. He looked at Norman and his men kneeling in a village that had been ruins 2 hours ago. "I will tell her," he said. He carried her to the wagon and pulled it home himself because she was not awake to argue. Sylvia slept for 14 hours. When she woke, Gina was sitting beside her bed with a bowl of soup and an expression that combined relief with the particular kind of exasperation reserved for people who care deeply about someone who refuses to take care of themselves. Sylvia drank the soup. She asked what had happened after she collapsed. Gina told her. Sylvia considered this for a moment. "They pledged loyalty while I was asleep. Norman said no oath was needed, no contract, just loyalty." Sylvia looked at the ceiling. She did not smile exactly, but something in her expression shifted, a loosening, a settling, like a knot that had been held too tight for too long easing by a single degree. "That is good," she said. And then, because she was 7, was Edward angry? Gina's mouth twitched. "He carried you home and pulled the wagon himself. He did not say a word the entire ride. When he handed you to me at the gate, he said, and I am quoting exactly, 'She did this on purpose to make me worry, and I will not give her the satisfaction of acknowledging it.'" Sylvia's expression brightened. "He was worried. He was furious. Those are the same thing." Gina did not argue with this. She had stopped arguing with this particular observation months ago because it was always correct. The night order came together in the days that followed. Edward ran logistics. Norman ran people. Brett handled the supply chain with an efficiency that made both of them look slow. They met in the Great Hall each morning over maps and patrol schedules, working through details the way soldiers work through a siege plan, methodically, without waste. Gina designed the uniforms, dark fabric, practical, based loosely on the Hughes ducal livery. Each bore a small crest on the left shoulder, a fortress with a vine growing up its wall. Gina had added the vine. No one asked her to. Everyone understood why. The weapons came from the mithril cache. Edward selected each one personally. Norman's men handled them with the reverence of soldiers who had spent years fighting with secondhand steel and suddenly found themselves armed with something that could cut through castle walls. Patrols began on the 3rd day. 2 routes, one circling the fortress and inner city, one running the perimeter to the coast. Fort had never had a visible military presence. Now uniformed knights with mithril weapons walked the streets in formation, and the effect was immediate. Merchants who had been hesitant about permanent stalls began building them. The tavern keeper stayed open past dark for the first time in months. Norman reported to Edward each evening, precise, economical, the bearing of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a command structure worth reporting to. They developed a working rhythm within days that most partnerships took months to build. Sylvia attended the morning meetings. She sat in her chair, feet still not reaching the floor, and listened to everything. She asked questions that were either blindingly obvious or devastatingly sharp, and no one could tell which until they had answered. She looked at the mithril swords and said they were pretty, which made Norman's men stand straighter. The families arrived over the following week. Wives, children, elderly parents. They traveled from wherever the clan had scattered. Each family presented themselves to Sylvia for the domination acknowledgement. Each family knelt. Each family felt the wave of recognition settle into them. One family did not kneel. Norman's son arrived on the 4th day. He was old enough to fight and young enough to believe fighting was the only thing that mattered. He had his father's build, but none of his composure. He walked into the courtyard with the kind of posture that announced opinions before they were spoken. Sylvia was standing on a low stone wall, reviewing the guard rotation with Edward. Norman's son looked at her, looked at the fortress, looked at the uniformed knights. Something in his expression curdled. He spoke to Norman. The tone carried everything: dismissal, contempt, the specific kind of scorn that young men reserve for things they have decided are beneath them. He said something about the Lord's age. He said something about what kind of future a clan could have following a child. The courtyard went quiet. Brett took a step forward. Edward raised one hand. Norman did not wait. He crossed the courtyard in 4 strides, seized his son by the collar, and forced him to his knees. He spoke in a voice that did not rise above conversational volume, worse than shouting. He told him to look at the Lord he had just insulted. He told him that the standard was not negotiable and that exceptions would not be made for family. His son said something back. Angry, loud, the wrong choice. "He cannot stay," Norman said. Sylvia had not moved from the stone wall. "He cannot stay," she said. Norman bound his son's arms and walked him to the gate. He was escorted through the checkpoint and out of fort before the afternoon shadows reached the courtyard wall. Norman returned within the hour and delivered his report to Edward. The expulsion was permanent. He would deal with the personal consequences on his own time. Edward nodded. He did not offer sympathy. Norman did not want it. He wanted his commander to know the job was done. Sylvia climbed down from the wall. She walked over to Norman, looked up at him, way up, and said, "Thank you for bringing your family here." He bowed. Not the formal bow of a knight to a lord, deeper, the kind that comes from a place a soldier does not usually visit. "It is an honor to serve," he said. He meant it the way Brett meant it when he signed his contract, the way Edward meant it when he came back through the gate, the way Gina meant it when she stopped calling it employment and started calling it home. Sylvia nodded once, turned, and walked back into the fortress with her pig following behind her. The patrols continued. The village on the southern coast held its first communal dinner that evening, and the smoke from the rebuilt hearth rose into the sky above fort like a signal, not of distress, but of something beginning. The report landed on Edward's desk 3 days before the woman herself arrived. Brett delivered it in the soundproofed office, the room Sylvia's magic had sealed so thoroughly that even the servants who cleaned it could not hear what was said inside. Cole stood by the window. Edward sat. Brett spoke without inflection. Bridget Marsh, first daughter of Marquis Marsh, late 20s, formerly engaged to the second prince of the neighboring kingdom. The engagement had been broken publicly, with the prince accusing her of bullying a baron's daughter he favored. Edward's hand stopped halfway to his jaw. Cole turned from the window. The accusation, Brett continued, was investigated through Norman's network, and independently through 2 merchant contacts. The baron's daughter in question had been correcting her manners, standard noble behavior, unremarkable in any court. The prince used it as pretext. The engagement was dissolved at his initiative. Bridget Marsh bore no fault in any account we found. Edward exhaled. Cole's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The priest's version of visible relief. "No debts," Brett said. "No political affiliations beyond her family's standard obligations. No intelligence ties. Marquis Aldrich likely sent her as a friendly correspondent, someone who would report back on Fort's condition without actually spying. Her reputation is consistent, capable, well-mannered, genuinely committed to education. So she is exactly what she appears to be," Edward said. "That is the most probable reading." Cole folded his hands. "Then we welcome her. and watch her anyway. Naturally, Edward looked at Brett. You are her household liaison. Manage her access. Nothing sensitive, nothing underground. She sees what a guest sees. Brett inclined his head and withdrew. Edward rubbed the bridge of his nose. After the assassins, after the spy, after Norman's son, a tutor who was simply a tutor felt like a trick the universe was playing on him. He did not trust it. He did not need to. He just needed to manage it. 2 carriages arrived from the Marquise's estate on a Tuesday morning. The woman who stepped out of the first one moved like someone trained to enter rooms since birth. Crimson hair pinned with quiet precision, sharp, intelligent eyes, a traveling dress that managed to look effortless despite clearly being chosen with care. She descended, surveyed the courtyard, and offered a curtsy so clean it could have been used as a teaching example. Edward and Cole met her at the gate. She was here to educate Fort's lord in noble etiquette, and she had brought a personal maid to assist with servant training. Edward smiled, his operational smile, warm enough to disarm, controlled enough to observe. She was neither haughty nor nervous, genuinely composed, not performing composure. That was rare in nobles visiting a frontier fortress run by a 7-year-old. He showed her to the guest quarters. She thanked him with the precise amount of warmth the situation called for. Edward returned to the office and told Cole that either this woman was the most dangerous person they had ever hosted or the most straightforward. Cole said he would reserve judgment until after she met Sylvia. The introduction happened the next morning. Gina had spent the previous evening fighting a war against Sylvia's hair. The battlefield was a dressing table. The casualties were 11 hairpins, 2 ribbons, and whatever remained of Gina's patience. Sylvia's hair was silver blonde and impossibly fine, soft, thin, and slippery in the way that defeated every updo before it began. The pins slid out, the braids unraveled, the carefully arranged curls collapsed like they had received bad news. By the time Sylvia walked into the drawing room, her hair was down. It had won. Gina had dressed her in a neat outfit instead, vest, pressed shirt, polished shoes, and declared the rest a problem for another century. Bridget was already waiting. She rose when Sylvia entered, and Brett announced the introduction from the doorway. Sylvia stepped forward and delivered her formal greeting in the flat, direct tone she used for everything. No inflection, no flourish. Just the words, spoken like items on a list she was checking off. Something happened to Bridget's face. It was fast, a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, a brief loss of the composure that had been flawless since she arrived. Her hands, folded neatly at her waist, pressed together hard enough that the knuckles whitened. She blinked twice. Then it was gone. She smiled, returned the greeting with a curtsy that was technically perfect, and said she was honored to serve as Sylvia's instructor. "There is no rush," Sylvia said, in the same flat tone. "You traveled a long way. If you need more rest, that is fine." Bridget made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a cough. She pressed one hand to her collarbone and said that she was simply experiencing the last effects of travel fatigue. She was perfectly well. She would begin lessons the following day. Edward watched from the side of the room. His eyes moved between Bridget's face and her hands. The hands told a different story than the face. After Bridget left, escorted by Brett, Edward turned to Sylvia. "What did you think?" "She seems kind," Sylvia said, "and she knows what she is doing. I could tell from the way she stood." Edward nodded. He did not mention the flicker. He filed it. The lessons began well. Bridget was, as Brett's report had suggested, an excellent teacher. She demonstrated posture, walking, and formal greetings with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where a single wrong step could end a political career. But she was not rigid. She watched Sylvia copy a curtsy and then adjusted it, not to make it more formal, but to make it suit a 7-year-old. She added a slight tilt of the head, a small pause before rising, a barely perceptible softening of the hands. "The standard curtsy is designed for adult women," she explained to Gina, who was observing. "For someone of the young lady's age, the effect should be charm, not formality. The court will not expect her to move like a grown duchess. They will expect her to be endearing. We use that." Sylvia performed the adjusted version. It was, by any honest assessment, devastatingly cute. Bridget's left eye twitched. She continued. "She taught the formal way to accept a greeting, the the formal way to decline food at a banquet, and the formal way to excuse oneself from a room. Sylvia absorbed each one with the speed of someone who had been teaching herself from books for years and finally had a living instructor to demonstrate. "You are remarkably quick," Bridget said. The compliment was genuine. Sylvia straightened with visible satisfaction, the posture of a child who has been told she did well and is not accustomed to hearing it. "This is easy for me," Sylvia said. Bridget's hand flew to her mouth. Her other hand gripped the edge of the desk. She made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a hiccup, and then her knees buckled. Gina caught her arm. Bridget's personal maid rushed forward from the corner where she had been sitting. Between them, they guided Bridget to a chair. "I am fine," Bridget said, though her face was the color of paper. "It is a chronic condition. Palpitations. They come and go. It is not contagious, and it is not serious. I simply need a moment." Sylvia stood very still, watching with the careful attention she gave to things she did not yet understand. Her brow furrowed. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No." Bridget managed a smile. "Truly, I will be ready to continue in a few minutes." Gina reported the episode to Edward and Cole that evening. Edward's expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. "She had these episodes before," Edward said. "The engagement to the prince. What if the bullying accusation was cover, and the real reason was this?" Cole shook his head slowly. "If the condition were the reason, the prince would have dissolved the engagement quietly. Fabricating a scandal suggests the prince wanted to humiliate her. The condition and the scandal are likely separate. Then, what is causing it?" "I have a theory," Cole said, "but I need to observe her more closely before I share it." The pattern became undeniable over the following days. Bridget taught well, patient, thorough, adapting her methods to Sylvia's speed without being asked. The hair remained an ongoing campaign. Bridget's maid joined Gina's efforts, and together they achieved a half updo that lasted almost 40 minutes before gravity reasserted itself. Bridget said they would revisit the matter when Sylvia was older, but the episodes continued, always in Sylvia's presence. Never when Bridget was alone with the maids. Never during meals when Sylvia was across the table speaking to Edward. Never in the corridors when they passed each other at a distance. Only during lessons. Only when Sylvia was close, speaking in that flat voice, performing a curtsy, or, on one memorable occasion, asking whether she could practice her formal walk while still holding her lunch, which was a bread roll shaped like a pig. That particular episode required smelling salts. Edward tracked the pattern with the methodical attention he applied to threats. He asked the high priest to examine Bridget. The priest provided healing magic. It did nothing. There was, the priest confirmed, no illness to heal. "Her body is healthy," the priest said. "Whatever is causing the episodes, it is not physical." Edward brought this to Cole. "I suspected as much," Cole said. "You suspected. My skill does not only show sin." Cole spoke carefully. "It shows the weight and quality of what people carry." Around Sylvia, Bridget's emotional state becomes intensely concentrated. It is not fear, not guilt, not deception. It is something I have not seen at this intensity before. It reads as positive, overwhelmingly so. Edward stared at him. "I would like to counsel her," Cole said. "With your permission. I believe she will tell me what this is, if I create the right conditions for her to speak." Edward agreed. He had no better options. The tutor was excellent, and the episodes were getting worse. Cole met Bridget in the chapel. He had chosen the space deliberately, neutral ground, not her guest room, not the office, not the drawing room where lessons happened. The chapel was quiet, and Cole's presence within it carried the authority of a priest rather than an interrogator. Bridget sat in the front pew with her hands folded. Her posture was perfect. She looked like a woman attending a service, not a woman about to confess something she had been hiding for years. "Sylvia is worried about you," Cole said. Bridget's composure cracked exactly 1 inch. Her fingers tightened against each other. "She asked me to speak with you," he continued. "She does not understand what is happening, but she has noticed that you are in distress. She asked whether there was something we could do. The young lady is very kind. She is, and she is also observant. She told Edward that the episodes only happen in her presence. She is correct." Bridget said nothing for a long time. The chapel was silent, except for the faint sound of wind against the windows. "It is not an illness," she said finally. "I know. It is not a political matter. It is not espionage. It is not a reaction to this fortress or its people. I know that as well." She looked at him. Her expression was the most open it had been since she arrived, stripped of noble training, of careful composure. What was underneath was mortification. "I love cute things," she said. Cole waited. "I love them beyond my body's capacity to manage." The words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "I have loved them since I was a child. Small animals, dolls, children in formal dress, anything that combines effort and smallness. I had a room full of stuffed animals that I had to clear when the engagement was formalized because the prince's household considered it inappropriate for a future princess. I managed. I suppressed it. For years, I suppressed it. Through every court function, every formal dinner, every meeting with the prince where I had to be exactly what they expected. I did not faint. I did not falter. I held it inside, and I was fine." She pressed both hands flat on the pew as if steadying herself against something. "Then I walked into a room and saw a 7-year-old girl in a vest and polished shoes greeting me with no expression on her face, and my nervous system capitulated entirely." Cole's mouth moved. He controlled it. "She rides a pig," Bridget said. "She rides a pig to city meetings. Her hair will not stay up. She says things like, 'This is easy for me,' in a voice that has no idea what it is doing to people. She practiced her formal walk holding a bread roll shaped like a pig. I cannot. My body cannot. I have tried everything I know, and nothing is sufficient. The suppression that held through an entire royal engagement cannot hold against this child." The chapel was very quiet. "The engagement," Cole said carefully. "The years of suppression. That is why the episodes are so severe now. Yes, the longer I held it in, the worse the release. I know this. I understood it when it started happening. I simply cannot stop it. Are you able to continue teaching effectively?" Bridget straightened. The question had landed on professional ground, and professional ground was where she was strongest. "Yes, absolutely. The episodes are brief. They do not affect my judgment or my methods. If I am permitted to manage them rather than suppress them entirely, I believe they will moderate over time. Then I will recommend to Edward that you stay," Cole told Edward. Edward's face went through several stages: suspicion, confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of exhausted acceptance that had become his default expression since moving to Fort. "Cute things," he said. "Cute things," Cole confirmed. Her engagement to a prince was not destroyed by politics or illness. It was destroyed because she loves cute things too much. The engagement was destroyed by the prince's cruelty. Her condition was a separate matter that she managed successfully throughout. It was only here, with Sylvia, that the management failed. Edward pinched the bridge of his nose. He held it for a long time. "I will tell Sylvia," he said. He found her in the drawing room. She was sitting at the broad desk with a book open in front of her, though she was not reading it. She was watching the courtyard through the window. Her pig was visible below, rooting contentedly near the gate. Edward explained the situation. He used short, clear sentences. He did not editorialize. Sylvia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly long enough to make him wonder whether she had understood. "Can she still teach?" Sylvia asked. Cole says yes. "The episodes do not affect her judgment. She is an excellent instructor. Then she stays." That was the entire assessment. Edward waited for more. There was no more. The 7-year-old Lord of Fort had processed the information, asked the functional question, received a satisfactory answer, and moved on. "Should we tell her she does not need to suppress it?" Sylvia asked. Cole recommended that. He thinks the severity will decrease if she is not fighting it. "Good, bring her here." Bridget arrived within minutes, escorted by Brett. Her composure was already fracturing at the edges, the particular tension of a person who has confessed something mortifying and does not yet know how it landed. Sylvia looked at her from the desk with the calm, direct expression she used for contract negotiations and night order formations. "Cole told us what is happening," Sylvia said. "You do not need to hide it. If the episodes happen, they happen. Can you still teach me?" Bridget's eyes were very bright. She swallowed once. "Yes, my lady, without question." "Good," Sylvia said. "Then we continue tomorrow." Bridget held herself together for exactly 11 seconds. Then the composure that had survived a royal engagement, a public humiliation, a cross-country journey, and 5 days of escalating neurological events gave way completely. She crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to her knees in front of the desk, gathered Sylvia into her arms, and buried her face against the top of Sylvia's head. "You are the most precious creature I have ever encountered," she said, in a voice that had left the register of noble decorum entirely. Your vest, your shoes, your face when you concentrate. I cannot bear it. I have wanted to do this since the moment I walked into this room, and I am so sorry. Sylvia did not flinch. She did not pull away. She sat in the embrace with the patient tolerance of someone standing in mild rain. It was happening. It was not unpleasant. There was no reason to resist it, and it would presumably stop at some point. It did not stop quickly. Edward stood in the doorway. Cole stood behind him. Edward wore the expression of a man who had prepared for assassins, political sabotage, and medical emergencies, and had received a noblewoman having a cuteness episode on the drawing room floor. She brought stuffed animals, Bridget said into Sylvia's hair. I brought 12 stuffed animals as gifts. I was not going to mention them because I thought it would be inappropriate. May I give them to you? I do not need stuffed animals, Sylvia said. They are very soft. I have a pig. Bridget made a sound that suggested the mention of the pig was not helping her condition. Gina appeared in the doorway behind Edward and Cole, took in the scene, and covered her mouth with both hands. Whether she was suppressing a laugh or a similar reaction was unclear, possibly both. When Bridget finally released Sylvia and stood, her face was flushed and her hair had come partially undone from its pins. She looked 5 years younger than the composed woman who had stepped out of the carriage. She straightened her dress, cleared her throat, and attempted to reassemble her dignity. I apologize, she said. That was a rare outburst. It will happen again, Cole said gently. It will happen again, Bridget admitted, but less severely, I believe. I hope. She looked at Sylvia with an expression that suggested hope was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Sylvia slid off the chair, walked to the door, and paused. Lessons tomorrow. Same time. She left. The pig was waiting in the courtyard below, and she had things to attend to, and the matter of the tutor who fainted from cuteness had been resolved with the same efficiency she applied to bridge repairs and night order formations. It was a problem. It had a solution. The solution was acceptance. She moved on. Bridget stayed. She stayed that day, and the next, and the one after. The episodes moderated, as Cole had predicted, not because the condition improved, but because the suppression ended. She fainted once more during a lesson where Sylvia sneezed mid-curtsy, and after that, she developed a system. She would excuse herself briefly, compose herself in the hallway, and return. Gina started keeping a glass of water and a cloth ready. It became routine. The lessons continued. Sylvia's etiquette improved steadily. Her hair continued to defy all intervention. Bridget stopped trying to force it into formal styles, and instead developed a set of arrangements that worked with the fine texture rather than against it. Loose, practical, elegant, in a way that suited a child who rode a pig and ran a city. Edward, when asked later by Gina whether he was relieved, said that the fortress had now collected an exiled child lord, a disgraced knight, an escaped seamstress, a priest hiding from assassins, a converted spy, a mercenary clan with a complicated past, and a noblewoman who fainted from cute things. We are, he said, exactly the kind of place where problems come to live. Gina pointed out that Bridget was not a problem. Edward said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved and Gina counted it. Brett did not knock. He entered the office with a sealed dispatch in his hand and a face that had already decided what came next. Edward was mid-sentence with Cole when he noticed. He stopped, waited. Brett set the paper on the desk and stood back. His voice was flat and efficient, the way it always was when the news was bad enough to require precision. Cosmo had been arrested. The charge was theft, filed by the workshop master in the town where Gina used to work. The accusation claimed that Cosmo and Gina had conspired to steal money from the business years ago. The arrest had happened 3 days prior. Norman's network had confirmed the details overnight. Edward read the dispatch once, then again. Cole watched his jaw tighten. The charge was bait. That was obvious within seconds. Cosmo had been circling the town for years, asking locals about Gina, trying to confirm she was safe. The workshop master had finally used it, a fabricated theft claim, with Gina named as co-conspirator, designed to require her presence at a hearing. Once she appeared in the town's jurisdiction, the master would petition for custody. He does not know she belongs to a lord's household, Brett said. No inflection, just the gap in the master's plan, presented like a chess piece on the wrong square. Edward leaned back. His fingers drummed once against the desk, then stopped. Cole could see him running the full calculation: jurisdiction, standing, timeline. How fast can you build a counter case? Brett's answer was immediate. He had already started. Gina's unpaid labor, the stolen inheritance, the blocked access to her uncle, the declining business since her departure. All of it was documented. All of it was ready to present. The only thing missing was formal authorization from Sylvia's household, which gave Gina legal standing as a recognized servant of a duke's daughter. Edward turned to Cole. "You tell her, not me." Cole nodded. He understood. Edward's mode in a crisis was operational. He would dismantle the legal mechanism, arrange the travel, prepare the court strategy. But the moment when Gina learned that her uncle had been searching for her, had never stopped searching, had been blocked at every turn by the people who claimed to love her, that moment required someone who knew how to hold the weight of it without dropping it. Edward was already pulling a second sheet of paper toward him. Brett stood ready. "We leave tomorrow," Edward said. "Full delegation, Sylvia's seal on every document." Cole had chosen the chapel deliberately. He chose it because the light was warm and the space was enclosed, and there were no windows that opened onto corridors where someone might overhear. He chose it because Gina had confessed her past to him in this room once before, and the walls remembered that trust. She came in expecting a routine conversation. He could see it in her posture, the easy way she settled into the chair across from him, the half smile she wore when she thought this was about scheduling or household matters. He did not begin with the arrest. He began further back. "Your Uncle Cosmo," he said. "How long has it been since you last saw him?" The half smile faded. Not alarm yet, just the careful attention of a woman who had spent years reading the emotional weather of a room. "Years," she said, "since before I went to the workshop. He offered to take me in, once. I was too young to understand what that meant. I stayed with the family that said they wanted me." Cole folded his hands on the table. His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice he used when the thing he carried was too heavy to rush. "He never stopped looking for you." Silence. "After you moved to the workshop, he came to the town. He asked locals to let him know if you ever left. He was blocked. The workshop family told him you were fine, that you did not want contact. He came back. They blocked him again. He came back again." Gina's hands were flat on the table now. She was not moving. "He has been doing this for years, Gina. Every time he found a way in, they closed it. Every time he tried to reach you, the master interfered. He never stopped. You did not know because they made sure you would not know." Her breath came in once, sharp and controlled, the sound of someone catching something before it falls. Her eyes were bright, but her jaw was set. She did not cry the way people cry in stories, all at once and loudly. She sat very still, and the stillness was its own kind of breaking. "Where is he now?" Cole told her. The arrest, the fabricated charge, the trap designed to bring her back into the master's reach. And then the rest of it. Edward and Brett were already building the case. Sylvia's name gave Gina standing the master had not anticipated. The countersuit was ready. The delegation was leaving tomorrow. She absorbed it all the way she absorbed everything, piece by piece, filing each fact into the place where it could be used. "What do I need to do?" "You need to be present at the hearing. You need to stand in that room and tell the truth. That is all." She nodded once. Then she was quiet for a long time, and Cole let the quiet hold. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thin but unbroken. "He was always there, and I thought I was the only one who remembered." Cole said nothing. Some truths are too large for commentary. He simply sat with her in the warm candlelight and let the years of not knowing settle into the shape of something she could carry. The courthouse was built to make people feel small. High stone walls curved inward. The light came from above, straight down, so that anyone standing in the center was illuminated like a specimen on a table. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular silence that accumulates in rooms where lives are decided. Gina entered from the east door. She was wearing the uniform she had sewn herself, the lady's maid attire of Sylvia's household, cut and fitted with the precision that only her hands could produce. Her hair was neat. Her bearing was composed. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who served a duke's daughter and had come prepared. Beside her, Cosmo walked with the stiff, blinking relief of a man who had spent 3 days in a cell and was still adjusting to the light. He was older than Gina remembered, weathered from years of traveling. His merchant clothes were rumpled from detention, but his eyes were kind and clear. And when he looked at Gina, he looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been searching for and finally found. The master and Kyle stood on the opposite side of the circular floor. The master presented his case first. His voice was measured and practiced, the voice of a man who had rehearsed his grievance. He spoke of raising Gina out of pity, of feeding her and clothing her, and teaching her a trade. He spoke of ingratitude, of money gone missing, of a conspiracy between Gina and her uncle to rob the family that had given her everything. Kyle added his piece. He spoke of Gina's obligations, of the years of investment the family had made, of how she owed them her return and her labor. His voice cracked with something between anger and petulance. He did not look at Gina directly. He looked at the space above her head, where it was easier. Brett stood and began. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He presented the evidence the way a surgeon presents an incision, cleanly, without flourish, designed to expose what was underneath, years of unpaid labor. Gina had worked in the workshop from childhood without compensation. Brett had financial records. He had testimony from local merchants who had watched the arrangement and said nothing. He had the accounting discrepancy that showed Gina's inheritance from her parents had been absorbed into the workshop's operating capital without documentation or consent, Kay testified. She stood before the court and spoke clearly, without looking at Kyle. She confirmed that she had given Gina money and supplies to leave. She confirmed that the workshop family had known Gina was unhappy and had done nothing. She confirmed that Kyle had promised Gina a future and then chosen a wealthier match when it became convenient. Kyle's composure shattered. He lunged forward, shouting. The master grabbed him hard and hauled him back. An official warned them both. Kyle was removed to a side chamber with a guard. The master apologized for his son and tried to recover his position, but the room had already shifted. Cole testified last. His voice was calm and factual. He spoke of what his absolution skill revealed, the weight it measured, the evidence of deliberate harm carried by the man standing across the room. The court recognized the skill. Its testimony was admissible. What Cole described was not ambiguous. The master saw it failing, all of it, the scheme, the charge, the years of control. And in the moment when a different man might have surrendered, the master tried something else. He turned to Gina and offered to adopt her, to make her his legal heir, to send Kyle away to his fiance's family and give the workshop to Gina entirely. His voice cracked with something that sounded almost like sincerity, and it might have been, buried under all the calculation. Gina said nothing. The master kept talking. He offered more. He apologized. He pleaded. He described the future he was willing to build for her, a future she had never been offered when she was useful enough to exploit without offering it. Gina said nothing. The silence expanded. It filled the high stone room. The officials waited. Brett waited. Cole waited. The master's voice thinned and then stopped, because there was nothing left to say into a silence that complete. The court ruled. The charges against Cosmo and Gina were dismissed. The countersuit was accepted. The master was found liable for years of exploitation and the fabrication of charges against a recognized servant of a noble household. He was sentenced to property confiscation, forced labor, and a permanent ban from Fort's territory. Kyle was confined pending evaluation. Brett informed Sylvia's household by sealed letter that the case was concluded. Everyone tried to stop her. Cosmo said she did not need to do this. Cole suggested it could wait. Brett offered to deliver any message she wished to convey. Edward, who had arranged the entire case from the background and never once entered the courtroom himself, sent word that the matter was settled and she owed the master nothing further. Gina listened to all of them. Then she asked to see the master in his cell. The guard led her down a stone corridor that smelled of damp and old iron. The torch on the wall threw uneven orange light across the floor. Her footsteps were steady. Her hands were at her sides. She was not clenching them. The master was sitting on a wooden bench behind the bars. He looked smaller than she remembered. His clothes were the same ones he had worn in court, creased now, the collar wilting. When he saw her, something moved across his face, something between hope and the memory of hope, and he started to speak. She did not let him finish. "You told me I was family," Gina said. Her voice was level, not angry, not trembling. The voice of someone who had practiced this in her head for years and was now, finally, saying it to the person it was meant for. "You said that when I was young enough to believe it. You said it every time I asked why I was not paid. You said it when I asked why Kyle's future mattered more than mine. You said it when I stopped asking. The master opened his mouth. She continued. I sewed every garment that left that workshop for 6 years. I trained your apprentices. I managed your accounts when your wife could not. I slept in a room above the shop floor because you told me the house was full, and I believed you because family does not lie about something that small. She took a breath. It was controlled, measured. The breath of a woman who knew exactly how many words she had left and intended to use each one. You stole my inheritance. You stole the money my parents left me. You did it slowly enough that I did not understand what was happening until it was already done. And when my uncle came looking for me, you told him I did not want to see him. You told him I was happy. You blocked him every time. For years, the master's eyes were wide now. He had not heard this assembled. He had not heard the full shape of it, spoken aloud, in a voice that was not accusing him, but simply describing what had happened, the way a person describes the weather. You tried to make Kyle my future so that I would never leave. When that failed, you tried to make the courts bring me back. When that failed, you offered to adopt me. She paused. You offered to make me your daughter in the same room where you accused me of theft. The silence in the cell was absolute. I am Sylvia's maid, Gina said. I serve a 7-year-old girl who gave me a contract and a title and a room of my own, and never once told me I should be grateful for it. I wake up in a fortress where people know my name and use it correctly. I eat meals I helped prepare at a table where I am welcome. I sew because I choose to, not because someone will go hungry if I stop. She looked at him directly. His face was crumpled. He was trying to speak, and what came out was not words. I am not coming back, she said. Not for the workshop, not for the adoption, not for anything you could offer me. This is the last time I will stand in front of you and explain myself, because after today, you are not someone I explain myself to. She turned. She walked to the cell door. She did not look back. The guard let her through. The corridor was empty. Her footsteps were the only sound, steady and even, all the way to the courtyard. Cosmo was standing in the courtyard. He had not gone inside. He had not tried to follow her. He was simply there, in the bright afternoon light, waiting with the patience of a man who had been waiting for years and could wait a few minutes more. Gina stopped when she saw him. She had been steady in the corridor. She had been steady in the cell. She had been steady through every word she had said to the master, because those words were not for him. They were for her, and she had needed to say them standing up. But Cosmo was not the master. Cosmo was the man who had come back every time, for years, blocked and lied to and turned away, and he had come back, because that is what you do when you are looking for someone you love and have not found them yet. He looked at her. His eyes were kind and wet and tired. He stroked her hair once, the way he had when she was small, and the gesture undid something she had been holding together since the chapel. She did not collapse. She leaned into him, and he held her, and they stood like that in the courtyard while the afternoon light moved across the stones. I thought about taking you by force, he said quietly. Years ago. I thought about it more than once, but I wanted to see you free, actually free, not traded from one cage to another. She pulled back enough to look at him. I am free. He studied her face. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. He nodded, slowly, and the years of searching settled into something that looked like rest. Your lord, he said. The little girl, Sylvia. She treats you well? Gina almost laughed. She gave me a magical contract and a title, and once asked me to fix a sock while sitting on a pig. She is 7 years old, and she runs a city. She treats me like I belong there. Cosmo's mouth worked for a moment. Then he said, very seriously, I would like to meet this pig. Kay came to find her before the delegation departed. She was dressed simply, without the merchant family finery Gina remembered. Her expression was composed, but there was something underneath it, something that had changed since the last time they had spoken. Gina thanked her for the money, for the supplies, for the testimony in court, which had cost Kay more than anyone in the room understood, because Kay had stood before a court and publicly contradicted the family she had been engaged into. Kay waved the gratitude away with one hand. I had my own reasons. I wanted to be done with them. Your case gave me the excuse to do it publicly. There was a pause. Gina waited. I ended the engagement, Kay said, matter of fact, as though she were reporting the weather, before the trial. Not because of the trial, because Kyle tried to hit me, and I decided that was the last time anyone in that family would raise a hand in my direction. Gina looked at her. She remembered Kay as a calculated woman, someone who weighed every interaction against its value. She had not expected this. She had not expected Kay to burn her own bridge and walk away from the ashes with her chin up. I did not love him, Gina said quietly. I wanted a family. He was the closest thing to one I had, but I did not love him. I know. Kay's voice was gentle in a way Gina had never heard from her before. Neither did I. They looked at each other across the courtyard. Two women who had both been shaped by the same family and had both, in different ways, decided that the shaping was finished. If you ever need help, Kay said, come find me, as long as it does not involve that workshop or anyone in it. If you ever want a vacation, Gina said, come to Forte. The fortress is strange and the Lord rides a pig, but the food is excellent and no one will ask you to be anything you are not. Kay smiled. It was small and real and surprised, as though she had not expected to be invited anywhere. They shook hands. Two women who had entered each other's lives through a family that deserved neither of them, parting on terms that neither had predicted. Gina watched her go. Then she turned toward the waiting carriage, where Cosmo was already arguing with the driver about the best route, and Cole was standing with his hands folded, and somewhere beyond all of it, a fortress and a 7-year-old girl were waiting for her to come home. Cosmo arrived on a Tuesday with a cart that looked older than he did and a mule that wanted nothing to do with the hill. Gina was already waiting at the gate. She had known since dawn because Brett's network reported every traveler within 2 days of Forte, and because she had asked to be told the moment her uncle's cart appeared on the southern road. She stood in her uniform, hands folded at her waist, composed and steady, and unmistakably the woman in charge of this entrance. He saw her before he reached the gate. He stopped the mule. He just looked. There was a long moment where neither of them moved, and then Gina walked down to the road and helped him with the cart's stuck wheel, as though this were any errand. And Cosmo let her because the alternative was standing in the road and weeping, and he was not the kind of man who did that in public. You look well, he said, which meant everything. She smiled. I am well. Sylvia appeared on the pig. This was not unusual for Forte. It was unusual for Cosmo, who had been told that Gina served a duke's daughter and had expected, at minimum, a tall woman with a formal bearing. Instead, a 7-year-old in a traveling cloak rode past on a pig the size of a small horse, stopped, dismounted with the casual authority of a general exiting a staff carriage, and looked up at him. She did not greet him with ceremony. She reached for her magic, and the domination pulse washed over him. The same gentle assessment she applied to every person who entered Fort's orbit. It lasted a moment. He felt it as a kind of warmth behind his sternum, followed by a calm certainty that the child in front of him knew exactly what he was and had decided he was acceptable. You can stay, Sylvia said. Not a question, not an invitation that could be declined, just a fact about the world she had decided to arrange. Cosmo blinked. He looked at Gina. Gina's expression said, yes, this is how it works here. You will get used to it. Gina walked him through the city the way a person walks someone through a house they have built with their own hands. She did not announce things. She pointed them out, and the pride was in the pointing. The bridge, rebuilt by a 7-year-old's magic. The trade road, open for the first time in years. The screening station at the northern gate, where every new resident was assessed before entry. The night order patrols, Narcizo clan soldiers in clean uniforms, moving in pairs with the easy confidence of people who belonged where they stood. Cosmo kept glancing at her, not at the city, at her. She was different from the girl he had spent years searching for, not in the ways he had feared, but in ways he had not imagined. She moved through the fortress staff like someone who knew every name and every role and had earned the right to know them. She spoke to servants and soldiers with the same level voice, neither deferring nor commanding, just present. When a young maid named Emma passed them and asked about the evening's linen order, Gina answered without breaking stride, and the answer was specific and correct, and delivered with the offhand competence of someone who had been doing this long enough that it was simply how she thought. She was not performing. She was not surviving. She was operating. Cosmo stopped at the corner near the market square. The mayor had already identified a location for his shop, a ground floor unit with a second-story residence and a small warehouse in the back. Sylvia's magic had built the structure overnight. The walls were clean and solid, the windows fitted, the door hung straight. It looked like something that had been there for decades. I could have taken you, he said quietly. Years ago, I almost did. I came to the workshop with a plan and a bag big enough for your things. I was going to walk in and walk out with you, and anyone who tried to stop me would have learned why I spent 20 years on merchant roads. Gina looked at him. I know, but I thought if I forced it, you would always wonder. You would always feel like someone else's decision. He rubbed the back of his neck. So I waited, and they kept blocking me, and the years kept going. You did the right thing. I did not do it because it was right. I did it because I was afraid of getting it wrong. She took his arm, the way a daughter might, and walked him the rest of the way to his new shop in silence. He did not need her to say more. He had spent years imagining what her life might look like, and the truth was simpler than any version he had built in his head. She was fine. Not fine the way people say they are fine when they are hiding something. Fine the way a well-built structure is fine. Load-bearing, settled, true. Edward set a cup of tea on the desk and did not drink it. Brett stood across from him with a thin folder and the expression of a man who had found something satisfying and was waiting for permission to be satisfied. The circuit is complete, Brett said. Edward nodded. He already knew. He had known since they left the capital region 2 weeks ago. Their disguises shed, their information distributed through channels so indirect that no name attached to any rumor and no rumor attached to any source. What they had done was this. Edward had spent years accumulating details, not because he planned to use them at first, because he could not stop his mind from cataloging the information even after he had sealed off the part of himself that cared. He knew the exact timeline of the assassination frame. He knew which witnesses had been coerced and which had been willing. He knew the specific documents his father had suppressed to avoid the political cost of defending his own son. He knew the chain of command that James had manipulated and the exact moments when the third prince had chosen to believe a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth. All of this had lived in his head like a sealed file. When he built the intelligence network for Fort, from Phase 6 onward, the infrastructure to use it had materialized without him consciously designing it. Brett's agents could move information between cities without leaving traces. Norman's clan had contacts in the capital from their mercenary years. The legal credibility Edward carried as Sylvia's head of security gave his name weight in rooms where it had previously been a liability. So Edward had, quietly, over the course of several months, introduced a series of carefully sourced reports into the capital's information economy. Not accusations, not revenge letters, just facts. Verifiable facts about the timeline of the assassination attempt. Details that, if investigated, pointed toward James as the architect rather than Edward as the perpetrator. Connections between James's career advancement and the specific moment Edward was removed. The kind of pattern that a suspicious prince, already under political pressure, might notice and find impossible to ignore. The third prince's trust in James, according to Brett's latest reports, had fractured. Not dramatically, not in a confrontation, in the way trust actually dies, through accumulating doubt, through the slow realization that the person standing closest to you might have been the one holding the knife. James was reportedly sleeping poorly. He had requested a security detail. He had begun monitoring his own household staff for leaks. The prince had reassigned several of James's responsibilities without explanation. Edward picked up the tea, drank, set it down. We told Sylvia nothing happened on our trip, he said. Technically accurate, Brett said. Nothing happened to us. The corner of Edward's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The expression of a man crossing something off a very old list. He did not feel triumphant. He had expected to feel triumphant years ago when he had imagined confronting James with a sword and a righteous speech about betrayal and justice. That fantasy had died somewhere around Phase 3 when he started building something instead of planning to destroy something. What he felt was this: the account was closed. James would spend the rest of his career looking over his shoulder. The prince would never fully trust his closest advisor again, and Edward would never have to explain to Sylvia why he had drawn a sword against a man she had never met for a wrong she had no part in. He had not done this for revenge. He had done this so that James would never be positioned to threaten Forte. That was the security justification, and it was real. But the narrator noted what it actually was, and what it actually was a man who had been wronged returning the wrong with compound interest, delivered at a temperature cold enough to be permanent. Brett collected the folder. Shall I file this? Burn it. Edward said. "There is nothing to file. Nothing happened." Bridget had prepared a speech. She had written it out in her room the night before, crossed out 2/3 of it, rewritten the remainder, and then discarded the paper entirely because the paper made it look like she was petitioning a court rather than speaking to a 7-year-old. What she said in the end was simple. "My assignment ends this week. I would like to stay permanently." Sylvia was sitting in a chair that was slightly too large for her, holding a teacup with both hands the way she always did. She looked at Bridget the way she looked at everything, with a calm, evaluating directness that had no business belonging to a child. "Are you still going to faint?" Bridget's composure held, barely. "I am working on it. I have successfully managed 2 official occasions without incident." Sylvia considered this. 2 is not many. 2 is more than 0. Bridget's voice was careful and measured, the voice of a woman who had spent her entire adult life projecting dignity in rooms where a single wrong step could end a political career. She used that voice now, and it held, and underneath it, Sylvia could hear something that was not dignity at all, but was simply a woman asking to be allowed to stay. Sylvia set down the teacup. "Then stay." Bridget signed the household commitment document that afternoon. It was not a contract spell, not the magical binding that Edward and Gina had chosen. It was a formal noble arrangement, the traditional kind, enforceable through social obligation and documented records. It said what it needed to say. She had been assigned to teach Sylvia etiquette. She had taught Sylvia etiquette. She was choosing, freely and with full knowledge, to remain. She wrote to Marquis Aldrich the same evening. The letter was polite and precise, the kind of letter one noble sends to another when a political arrangement is shifting shape. She explained that she was staying, that her role had evolved beyond the original assignment, that Fortslord required ongoing instruction, and that she was the appropriate person to provide it. Aldrich's response arrived within the week. He accepted with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been calculating this possibility for months. His letter included a brief, dry note about adjusting his other intelligence contacts in the region, which told Bridget that he had always understood her value was as much in what she observed as in what she taught. She filed the letter and did not dwell on it. The pig reaction was, she noted in her personal journal, down to a manageable level. She had survived 2 formal occasions without losing consciousness. The incident at the gate, where Sylvia had ridden the pig past her while carrying a chicken under one arm, had produced only a sharp intake of breath and a controlled retreat to the nearest chair. Progress. Undeniable progress. The mayor had recommended them. That was how most people arrived at Fort now, through the city's own systems, rather than through crisis or exile. Grant was 40, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been shaping food since he was old enough to hold a knife. His daughter Deborah was in her early 30s, quieter, with the self-contained quality of a woman who had made a decision about her life, and was still learning whether it was the right one. They had owned a restaurant, the only restaurant in the city that served proper course meals, the kind of cooking that required training and tradition, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. Grant had inherited it from his father. He had raised his children in it. The kitchen was the center of their family, in the way that some families are centered by a hearth or a table, or a particular room where everyone gathers without being asked. Then, Deborah's younger brother Dean inherited it, and everything came apart. The inheritance had not been Dean's idea. It had been Deborah's. She had loved a man named Napoli, the carpenter's son, and he had loved her back, but neither of them had said it, and the silence had gone on long enough that Napoli married someone else. After that, Deborah looked at the restaurant and saw a future she no longer wanted to live inside. She told her father to give the restaurant to Dean. She stepped aside. Dean was not a bad person. He was simply not ready. His wife could not tolerate the noise and the pressure and the endless stream of demanding customers. She went back to her family. Dean, alone and overwhelmed, asked his father and sister to leave. He gave them their earnings. He said he would manage. He could not manage. Grant and Deborah found themselves on the street with their skills and their savings, and nowhere to put either one. They had visited the mayor to say goodbye before leaving the region entirely. The mayor, who kept a running list of Forte's needs, had looked at Grant and said 2 words: the fortress. So here they were, in a kitchen that was larger and better equipped than anything they had worked in before, learning that everything they knew about cooking was, in Edward's precise and devastating assessment, commoners' home cooking with adequate presentation. The training was brutal. Edward and Cole had standards drawn from noble households where a poorly seasoned sauce could end a career. Grant and Deborah were taken apart and rebuilt. They remade dishes until their hands ached. They learned plating techniques that turned food into something a Marchioness would pause over. They learned flavor balances that no restaurant in an isolated city had ever required. They endured it because they were professionals, and professionals recognize competence, even when it arrives in the form of a man telling you that 30 years of experience have produced mediocrity. After the evening service was done and the kitchen was cleaned and the last of the staff had filed out, Grant and Deborah sat in the alcove near the back door where the night air came through and the lantern light was low enough for honesty. Deborah spoke first. She had been thinking about the neighboring country. Before the mayor's offer, she had been planning to leave the region entirely, start fresh somewhere no one knew her name or her family's restaurant, or the fact that she had given up the one thing she was supposed to inherit. I thought about dying somewhere nobody knew me, she said, not dramatically, the way a person states a fact they have already moved past. I thought maybe if I disappeared, someone would cry, or maybe I would make it big on my own and come back, and everyone would be sorry they let me go. Grant was quiet for a long time, and then the mayor said the fortress needed cooks, and I thought, well, that is not disappearing, and it is not coming back in triumph. It is just staying. Staying is harder than both, Grant said. He put his arm around her shoulders, the way he had when she was small, and the kitchen was still the safest place in the world. She did not pull away. Your bluntness comes from me, he said. Your kindness comes from your mother. Someone will see both someday. Deborah shook her head. I am not thinking about that anymore. If I married, it would only burden you. We cannot afford to have either of us fall sick until we have trained enough staff to cover the kitchen. Grant looked at her, his daughter, who had given up a restaurant and a man and a future she had planned differently, and who was now talking about staffing logistics instead of grief. He recognized this. He had done the same thing himself years ago, replacing the shape of one loss with the structure of something manageable. They sat in the quiet. Through the alcove door, they could see the courtyard, lit by the fortress lamps that Sylvia's magic kept burning through the night. The walls were solid. The city beyond them was alive. The kitchen behind them was clean and ready for tomorrow. We are not going back, Deborah said. Even if Dean begs, Grant nodded. We are not going back. It was not yet hope. It was the thing that comes before hope. The moment when you realize that the ground beneath you is solid enough to stand on, and that standing is enough for now. The word came through the town network first. Dean had closed the restaurant. His wife had gone back to her family. The dining room that Grant and Deborah had built over decades sat dark and empty, and the man who had inherited it could not keep the candles lit. Now he wanted them back, not because he missed them, but because he could not do what they did. Mick brought the full picture to Brett that morning. Brett listened without expression, his hands clasped behind his back. He has been asking around town, Mick said. Who works at Fort, whether Grant and Deborah are here. He is not being subtle about it. Brett considered this the way he considered most problems, briefly, and with a conclusion already forming before the consideration was technically finished. I will inform Cole. Cole will inform Edward. The situation will be managed before it reaches the kitchen. Mick nodded. He had hoped for exactly that answer. Brett left without hurrying. Mick stood in the corridor for a moment, thinking about what it meant that he had known to bring this to Brett instead of to Grant. A year ago, he would not have understood the difference between passing a message and managing where a message lands. Cole brought the report to Edward in the tower study. Brett stood near the door. Edward was seated behind a desk covered in correspondence that he would deny was intelligence work if anyone asked. Cole laid it out plainly. Dean's restaurant had failed. He wanted his father and sister back to repair what he could not maintain. Edward exhaled through his nose, the sound a man makes when a problem is too small to be interesting, but too real to be ignored. He trained under them for years, Edward said. They taught him everything. He chose to push them out. Now the thing he pushed them out of is broken, and he wants the people he pushed to come fix it. Cole nodded. The pattern is not uncommon. Handle it. Edward did not look up from his correspondence. Brett intercepts at the gate. Grant and Deborah do not need to know he came until after he has left. They have dinner to prepare. Cole turned to leave, then paused. I will position Mick near the gate as well. He knows the family. If Brett needs support that is not operational in nature, Mick can provide it. Edward looked up. A flicker crossed his face, the kind of expression he wore when someone in his household demonstrated growth he had not explicitly trained into them. Fine, and that was the end of the briefing. Dean arrived before midday. Brett saw him from 50 paces, a young man walking with the particular stride of someone who believed the errand he was on was reasonable. Dean had the look of a person who had rehearsed what he was going to say and had not considered what he would hear in response. Brett stepped into the path before Dean reached the gate proper. He introduced himself as the head of household operations for the Lord of Forte. He explained in the formal and unhurried tone that made people feel they were being managed rather than confronted, that Grant and Deborah were employed by the Lord's household and were not available. Dean argued. His words came through as the narrator expected, the sound of a man invoking family, invoking obligation, invoking the idea that blood created a claim on labor. He said his father and sister belonged with him. He said the restaurant was their legacy. He said he needed help, and they were the only ones who could provide it. Brett did not move. Brett did not argue. Brett simply repeated the fact, with the patience of stone. Grant and Deborah served the Lord of Fort. Their employment was not a temporary arrangement. The household did not release staff on the basis of external family requests. Dean's voice rose. Brett's did not. Then Mick stepped forward. He had been standing near the gatehouse, positioned there by Cole's quiet instruction. He had heard every word, and for the first time in his life, the thing Mick felt was not uncertainty about whether he had the right to speak. It was certainty that he did. Grant and Deborah built something here, Mick said. His voice was level, not loud, not performing anger, just direct, the way a person speaks when they have decided the truth is sufficient. They trained under people who demanded the best from them, and they gave it every day. The food they cook is served to a lord who notices the difference between good and careless. They earned this position. Dean stared at him. Mick was nobody to Dean, a servant, a load carrier, a person who existed in the background of a world Dean had never bothered to examine. Your restaurant failed because you could not do what they do, Mick continued. You had every chance. They taught you. You chose to push them out, and now the thing you pushed them out of is empty. That is not their problem to solve. Go home. Figure out what you are going to build with your own hands, because you cannot keep expecting other people to build it for you. The silence after that was the kind that has weight. Dean stood in it. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Nothing came out that mattered. He left. Brett watched him walk back down the road toward town. He said nothing to Mick. He did not need to. The slight adjustment in his posture, a fraction of a degree less rigid, the servant's equivalent of a standing ovation, said it clearly enough. Mick exhaled. His hands were shaking, and he put them behind his back so no one would see. While Dean was being turned away at the gate, Sylvia was walking through the fortress with a chicken under her arm. The chicken was one of her originals, one of the animals that had followed her out of the Hughes estate on the first day, walking in a neat and improbable line behind a 7-year-old girl who had just been exiled by her own mother. The chicken was calm. Chickens were always calm around Sylvia. She had that effect on things. She had not been told about Dean. Cole had managed the situation without involving her. Sylvia came to the kitchen for a reason that had nothing to do with Dean and everything to do with the fact that she had been thinking about this for days and had decided that today was when she would say it. She stood in the kitchen doorway. The kitchen was the room she had helped rebuild in the early months, back when the fortress was stone and silence and possibility. Now, it was something else entirely. The hearth was lit and had been lit since before dawn. 2 large pots simmered on iron hooks over the coals, and the smell that rose from them was the kind of smell that makes a building feel inhabited. Stock made from bones and herbs, slow and patient. The smell of food that someone has been caring about for hours. Bread sat cooling on a stone shelf near the window. Flour dusted the work surface where Deborah had been rolling dough. A basket of root vegetables waited near the chopping block, scrubbed clean, their skins still damp. Grant was at the far counter, his sleeves pushed past his elbows, his hands working through the preparation of something that required attention and knife skill, and the particular kind of focus that only people who have cooked for decades carry in their wrists. Deborah stood at the central table, arranging cuts of meat on a wooden board with the precision of a woman who had cried through weeks of training and emerged on the other side of it, knowing exactly what she was capable of. They had not heard about Dean. They did not know he had come. They did not know he had been turned away. They were doing what they had done every morning since arriving at Forte, making food worthy of the household they served. Sylvia stepped into the kitchen. The chicken shifted under her arm, but did not protest. Grant noticed her first. He straightened, wiped his hands on his apron, and turned to face her the way a professional faces the person they work for, with attention, with respect, with the readiness to hear whatever was about to be said. Deborah looked up from the cutting board. Her hands went still. Sylvia stood there, 7 years old, silver blonde hair loose around her shoulders, gray-blue eyes steady and direct, looking at them the way she looked at everything, without decoration, without preamble, without any understanding of how much the next sentence would mean to the two people hearing it. "The food you make is delicious," she said. "The kitchen smells good every morning now. Bridget says the dinner you made last week was the best she has had since she left the capital." She paused. The chicken made a small sound. Sylvia adjusted her grip on it. "I would like you to stay," she said. "Both of you. I want you to keep being the ones who are here." She said it simply, the way she said everything, as a statement of what she wanted, offered without leverage, without command, without any awareness that what she was doing was giving two people the answer to a question they had been carrying since the day they walked through the fortress gate. Grant looked at Deborah. Deborah looked at Grant. The answer had been decided weeks ago, maybe months ago. Maybe it had been decided the first morning Deborah woke up before dawn to start the stock and realized she was not dreading it. Maybe it had been decided the evening Grant tasted his own dish after Cole's corrections and understood for the first time what his cooking could actually become. Maybe it had been decided every day they had spent in this kitchen, cooking for a household that noticed, that cared, that treated the food on the table as something that mattered. The answer was yes before Sylvia finished asking. Grant's voice was rougher than usual when he spoke. "We are not going anywhere, my lady." Deborah nodded. She could not speak immediately. She pressed her lips together and nodded again, harder, and then she said, "We will stay. We will stay as long as you will have us, and we will not let Edward take over this kitchen." Sylvia blinked at that. She did not know what Edward had to do with the kitchen. She accepted the answer the way she accepted most things, directly, without ceremony, with the calm of a child who had asked for what she wanted and received it. "Good," she said. And then, because she was 7 and because the chicken was getting heavy, "Can you make something with this chicken? I think roasted, with the herbs from the garden." Grant took the chicken from her with hands that were not entirely steady. Deborah turned back to the cutting board because her eyes were wet, and she was not the kind of person who let people see that. Sylvia left the kitchen. She did not look back. She did not know that she had just done the thing that the entire story had been building toward. Not a battle, not a declaration, not a confrontation with the family that abandoned her. A request, a chicken, the people who mattered, choosing to stay. Cole was standing in the corridor outside the kitchen. He had been there for the last several minutes. He had heard everything. He did not say a word to Sylvia as she passed. He simply watched her walk away, a 7-year-old girl in a traveling cloak, heading toward whatever she had decided to do next. And he thought that a direct request from a child who did not know what it meant was more effective than anything he could have arranged. He was right. Evening came to Fort the way it always did, slowly, and with the particular quality of light that made the old stone walls look like they had been built for exactly this hour. The kitchen had the sound of dinner being made. Grant and Deborah moved around each other with the precision of two people who had cooked together for so long that conversation was unnecessary. The chicken was in the oven. The herbs were from the garden that Sylvia had grown with her own magic, and the smell that drifted through the lower corridors was the kind of smell that made people walk slower and breathe deeper without knowing why. At the edge of the city, near the road that led to the rebuilt bridge, a lamp burned in the window of Cosmo's repair shop. He was bent over his workbench, fitting a cracked housing back together with the careful hands of a man who had spent his whole life fixing broken things. His shop had been open for 2 months. He had customers. He had a niece who lived in the fortress above and came to visit him on her half days. He had stopped traveling. Norman's night order completed its evening patrol. The men moved through the streets of Forte in pairs, their routes predictable and their presence steady. The kind of security that works not because it is dramatic, but because it is reliable. Norman himself stood at the garrison entrance, exchanging a few words with his lieutenant before heading inside. The city had been safe for months. The patrols continued anyway, that was the point. In the drawing room window of the second floor, Bridget was visible. She appeared to be pressing a handkerchief to her face. Earlier that afternoon, Sylvia had been seen carrying a chicken through the fortress corridors while riding on the back of a pig, and Bridget had not recovered from the visual. She would be fine by dinner. She was always fine by dinner. The fact that she no longer tried to pretend the reaction was not happening was, in its own way, the clearest sign that she had found the place she belonged. Gina was in the household corridor, speaking with one of the senior maids about the schedule for the following day. Her voice carried the steady, organized tone of a woman who managed the daily operations of a duke's household and had grown into the role so completely that it was impossible to remember a version of her that had not done this. She finished the conversation, made a note in a ledger she kept in her apron pocket, and moved on to the next item. She did not pause. She did not need to. The rhythm of the household was hers now, and it ran the way she had shaped it. Edward was in the tower. He was doing something he would describe, if asked, as a security review of the surrounding terrain. He was not doing a security review of the surrounding terrain. He was standing at the window, looking out over the city that a 7-year-old girl had claimed from nothing, watching the lights come on in houses that had been dark for years before she arrived. His arms were crossed. His expression was the one he wore when he was thinking about something he would not say out loud. The city below him was full. The fortress behind him was full. The road he had walked down with a suspicious stew and a girl who did not know she was powerful was the same road that now carried trade wagons and visiting merchants and night patrols. He did not smile. He did not need to. Cole was at his church. The small stone building at the edge of the fortress grounds had become, over the months, the place where the city's residents came to speak about things they could not speak about elsewhere. Cole sat in the front pew, alone, in the quiet that he had built into the space the way an architect builds silence into a cathedral. His skill showed him every sin that walked through the door. It also showed him the absence of sin in a 7-year-old girl who used her magic to grow herbs for a chicken dinner. He had never solved that mystery. He had stopped trying. Some things were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be protected, and Sylvia was asleep on a pig. The pig was in the courtyard, lying on its side in the last patch of evening sunlight, its breathing slow and content. Sylvia was curled against its flank, her traveling cloak pulled over her like a blanket. Her silver blonde hair fanned across the pig's side. She had fallen asleep after delivering the chicken to the kitchen, the way she fell asleep after most acts of magic, or most acts of emotional expenditure, completely, without transition, as if her body simply decided that the day's work was done and shut down. The fortress was quiet. The city was quiet. The evening settled over Fort like a hand resting on something it had decided to keep. 12 people. 12 people who had arrived at different times, for different reasons, carrying different wounds, and who had each, in their own way and at their own pace, stopped leaving. A girl who did not know she was worth staying for. A knight who could not admit he had stopped wanting to leave. A seamstress who had reclaimed her own name. A priest who saw sins everywhere except in the child he served. An operative who had signed his soul away and considered it the best deal he had ever made. A knight commander whose clan had found its home. A noblewoman who had stopped pretending. A merchant who had stopped searching. 2 cooks who had been asked to stay by a child holding a chicken. The fortress that Sylvia had claimed alone at 7, exiled by her own family to a place they expected would kill her, was full. Not the battles, not the trials, not the revenge executed cold and clean across a kingdom. The whole story was this. A child walked down a road with a line of animals behind her, and by the end, the road led to a place where people chose to stay. The pig shifted in its sleep. Sylvia did not wake up. The light faded. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and herbs from the garden. Forte held.